The Southern California wildfires took more than people's homes and treasured memories. For many families, generational wealth, grown over decades and inspired by the hopes of those who traveled west during the Great Migration, was lost too. CBS's Elise Preston reports on the fear some families will never be made whole again.
Gone in Altadena, not just individual dreams, but entire legacies. And for one extended family, the Benns, parents, children, grandchildren, cousins, 20 homes, all in the same bloodline, destroyed.
I lost everything.
We met Oscar Ben and his daughter Lauren.
There's nothing to dig from the rubble. So I'm grateful that we have our lives. Really grateful for this daughter of mine.
The Ben family fled the Jim Crow South in the 1950s, settling in Altadena and building generational wealth.
Altadena represents and epitomizes the gains that were made during the civil rights movement, particularly in housing. It was the one area where homeownership was really possible.
Paul Ong heads the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge at UCLA. He says Altadena's black community boomed during the Great Migration, when LA's black population more than tripled. But in recent years, Altadena's home prices have skyrocketed. Ong fears that after the fire, generational wealth could be lost to gentrification.
We've seen this before. After Hurricane Katrina, more than 100,000 black people were permanently displaced.
Right. Altadena is a litmus test about how committed we are to racial justice.
There's no plan to sell. Absolutely not. And we've gotten calls, plenty.
We've gotten calls already.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Does that anger you?
It is incredibly angering to know that amidst our tragedy, there is hope for someone else's pocket.
As the Benns mourn the soul of a lost community.
My middle school's gone, our post office is gone. Places of a great routine of life are absolutely wiped off the face of the earth.
There's an uneasy feeling of what's next.
So even if our homes rebuild, our neighborhood has to too, our city.
If Altadena changes, will you walk away from the land that's been in your family for generations?
No. No. We've earned that land.
For this family of accomplished musicians, the desire to start recovering and rebuilding is firmly rooted in faith. Elise Preston, CBS News, Altadena, California.
The Cows, Gusty Renegade, in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the global system of white supremacy. Earth Day, we've had a number of programs. Dr. Sylvia Hood Washington, I can remember specifically, joined us a few years back, talked about her book, Packing Them In. Some of those very themes come up in the book we'll talk about today, but Earth Day, few years back. Any hoodles, the audio that we heard at the beginning, Gus T invested quite a bit of time in talking about the California wildfires from earlier this year, and specifically the impact that they have had on black homeowners in the Altadena region. Now, even back to Earth Day, Gus T has spent quite a bit of time talking about all of the contamination from those wildfires and what are you breathing when you have all these houses, vehicles, and everything that you would have in a residence when that burns down, as opposed to this is just a normal forest fire and all the contamination of that. What are the long-term health ramifications of that? Lead and everything else, asbestos. Environmental racism again. Anyway, we've been talking about that and even having guests on the program from the California area to talk about the devastation and black homeowners' efforts in Altadena to recover from all of this devastation. And within the last couple of weeks, I saw an article talking about all of this and specifically the racism within everything that happened in California. The report specifically how racism fueled the Eaton Fire's destruction in Altadena. A scholar explains why discrimination can raise fire risk for black Californians. I said, man, we've been talking about, or at least I have been talking about that, and super important. Go check out the article, and it even links to a book that he just wrote that talks about this on a much wider scale than what happened in California, although it's certainly relevant on a local level. Even a teaspoon from the article, it reads, racism fuels the fire. Those inequities were a tinderbox that the Eaton Fire ignited. Altadena is inherently prone to fire because it borders the Angeles National Forest, gets Santa Ana winds that spread embers, and has highly flammable vegetation. But because black Altadenans' homes sit on smaller lots with structures and landscaping located closer together, the ember fires spread more easily in black neighborhoods. Black Altadenans also tend to be older than their white neighbors because most had bought into the area before the real estate boom of the 1980s. The physical and financial strains typical of an aging household may have caused hardships for removing vegetation, a best practice in protecting a structure from ember fire. And that's at the end where he's gone over all the years and decades of deliberate racism to put black people in these structures. And they even had a report in the LA Times within the last 2 weeks. I shared it on social media where they were saying that some of the black people, homeowners in Altadena specifically, this region is what they call unincorporated. And they said, oh man, did that play a part in the delayed evacuation? And there was confusion. Remember, we talked about that in terms of alerts to evacuate. Do you need to leave? Or some of these alerts, it seems, were fake, and all this confusion. They're saying was the fact that this region is unincorporated, did that impact the fire response and the casualties? Non-white people, black people specifically, lose again. Anyway, all of that is kind of the motivating factor. But man, I will tell you, I read the article, then I got the book, right? Book just came out 2025, so Gus T already gets to scratch off his list. Nonfiction book published in the current calendar year. Check. I go to get the book, and I will say, man, this book was more constructive than I wanted. I was hoping to talk about California, and I kept reading the book like, wow, this has a lot of good information. Even though we've talked about economics, white supremacy, racism before, this is a quality read to add to the shelf. It's not gargantuan War and Peace length, short and right to the point, footnotes, lots of other information for you to investigate. And I even have to pause so we can try and get as much info as possible. I can't forget Prince because I need every possible thing that I played. I didn't play that for no reason. I never include sound for no reason. That was Prince specifically. One, he died April 21, 2016. It's been 9 years? Yep, 9 years. And then that song specifically, right? But then even beyond, you get all that money, and Prince, he should easily still be with us, right? He had all that money and everything. Michael Jackson, Kobe Bryant, But specifically with Prince, didn't he have bound laborer? Didn't he have that written on his face? Talking about, man, these old racists, music industry, even you get out and sell all these records and songs and Purple Rain and do it the Super Bowl, and even then, they don't treat me like I'm a world-class genius musician. They treat me like a Negro, bound laborer. Didn't he have that? He had that tattooed like on his face. Y'all remember? You don't remember? Anyway, our broadcast for today, 2025 publication. So that means it just came out, right? The Plunder of Black America, How the Racial Wealth Gap Was Made. Just came out, and as I said, lots of great information. Super excited to chat about the book, and then we have to make time to get a detail about the article in as well, because that was so important in the wildfires and the impact on black homeowners. I think that is so important. One of the most important things that I've seen this calendar year so far. Super excited to have him as a guest on the program. In addition to all the great writing that we've talked about, our guest, graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and the University of Virginia. Shout to Heather Hare. Glad to have him on the program, joining us live. Our guest, Professor Calvin Schermerhorn. Professor Schermerhorn, are you with us, sir? Let's see, not hearing him. Let's see. Make sure. Are you there, Professor Schermerhorn? Let's see. Up. One. All right, there we go. Try it one more time. Might have missed out on our intro, but are you able to hear me now, Professor Schermerhorn?
I can hear you now. Yes,
awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. I think I forgot. That was my fault. I think I forgot to tap the line over to pull you over onto our broadcast line. But guaranteed, I gave a great introduction, short of saying that you were the one who invented sliced bread and silverware and cured COVID-19. Everything else, Grave. All the credits. We'll give a plug for the book one more time. Again, 2025 publication, The Plunder of Black America, How the Racial Wealth Gap Was Made. And then I said that was not what I found first. What I found first was the report specifically on the California wildfires, how racism fueled the Eaton Fire's destruction. In Altadena, a scholar explains why discrimination can raise fire risk for black Californians. Now that we have him with us proper, thank you so much for sharing a bit of your Tuesday afternoon. Anything that you would like to share with our listeners about who you are and the work that you do, Professor Schermerhorn?
Oh, yes. Thank you for having me on. I began this exploration as a project that studied the afterlives of enslavement. And there's quite an academic debate around this issue. A lot of people said, well, the 13th Amendment, Reconstruction, African Americans were, basically on their own to rise or fall as talent would take them. Of course, we know about Jim Crow and the 90 long years between the end of Reconstruction and the Voting Rights Act. But the more that I looked at this issue and the more that I studied and was the beneficiary of so much other scholarship, the more the pieces seemed to fit together. That it wasn't a big break between slavery and freedom. There was always this thing that Frederick Douglass identified as the plunder, and it had many manifestations, slavery being one of them. But what we've seen over the last 150, 160 years since emancipation has been successive iterations of that process of wealth stripping and the theft of African American labor and labor value, really.
Spectacular. We will try to cover as much as we can. Lots of great information from Professor Calvin Schermerhorn. Wahoo wah. Oh, you missed that because I got in Harvard grad, University of Virginia. Shout out to Heather Hare. Now you got that too. You are classified as a white man. Is that true?
That is correct.
Okay. This program, we start all of our broadcasts, very important words. I use the term racism and the term white supremacy as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. A global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you think such a system exists? Do you think that definition is accurate?
Yes, and the demonstration of this isn't simply, what's in people's hearts or individual attitudes or individual discriminatory practices. It's the structure. And the structure that I've studied is reflected in the gaping racial wealth gap. And what does that mean? That means that the typical black household in the United States has something like 1/7 or 1/8 the wealth of the typical white household, and that's 160 years after emancipation. So why is that? Now, the proponents of racial difference as essential characteristics of human beings will say, well, that's because there are deficiencies. There's a cultural deficiency, there's an inherent deficiencies. But I don't think that's accurate. I think what explains this better is the momentum of historical events and processes in which one form of stripping wealth and stripping labor value from Black Americans was replaced by another over time. And we see those successive iterations. Sometimes we call it freedom. Sometimes we call it progress, and sometimes it looks a lot like progress. People are absolutely better off today than they were, say, in the 1930s or the 1830s. But when we discuss this structural racism, what we need to think about is the relative, the equity in the system, and that is sorely lacking here.
Just for listeners, much obliged for your response. Just for listeners, I want to be explicit. I don't use the term structural racism. That's doing a little pussyfooting. System of white supremacy, racism, and even added emphasis. Professor Schermerhorn's book is specifically focused and in a very granular way that I appreciate on the United States, but this is global. You would find the exact same economic disparities anywhere in the world. I am not aware of anywhere where it would be the opposite, and it would be Black people have everything and the white people are just poor and struggling and don't have nothing. And do we have a pair of old shoes that we can send them as sardines? I'm not aware of that anywhere in the world. Are you, Professor Schermerhorn?
No, and when I was fortunate enough to go to the UK a few years ago, I looked into the racial wealth gaps in Great Britain, and they have a remarkably similar origin and manifestation. That is that you have cities in which you have concentrations of Black poverty and discrimination. You have a history of what I speak of like a push and a pull. Around the middle of the 20th century, right after World War II, the British economy was in tatters, and they wanted to pull in workers, laborers, skilled laborers, people who were able to run and serve the national health system, people who are able to be, essential workers in a time of great national need. But because they came from the greater Caribbean, or they came from South Asia, or former colonies in Africa, on the African continent, they became subject to good old-fashioned racism, as you mentioned, white supremacy. And you had British leaders like Winston Churchill who were sympathetic to the slogan, "Keep England white," or "Keep Britain white," even though they depended on those workers. And so today you see a lot of patterns in the United Kingdom that are similar to what we see in the United States.
Bravo, bravo, much obliged. That's not in the book, but bravo, much obliged, Professor Schermerhorn. This question, and I thought of this many times as I was reading the text. I have to go to some of the specific passages where this question came to mind for me. Particularly with what you have written in The Plunder of Black America, How the Racial Wealth Gap Was Made. Oh, that's Windrush for non-white listeners who are in the States or other parts of the world. That is so important what he just discussed. That is the Windrush generation. Don't let me be an ignorant host. They have whole books and scholarship about, you want to talk about economic exploitation. you beg these black people from Jamaica or wherever to come over and do all this work and clean up, and then you practice racism and call them nignogs and all the rest, and then same thing we would hear about slavery in this part of the world. Maybe you got a passport, visa, and paperwork. Maybe you didn't. And if you didn't, oh man, what is your thanks for all of that labor? Now get out of here, you undocumented, no count nigger, that sort of thing. But that Windrush generation is what they call all of that, and that continues to be can you imagine being 70, 80 years old and them come and say, hey, you don't have no paperwork, we might have to boot you on out of here? Like, what? What? Anyway, other part of the world, global system. I've asked our guest for a decade now. There was a non-white author. He wrote a piece in the New Republic about racism specifically, and he said white people are often greatly and sincerely pained by racism, but rarely are they pained enough. Based on what you wrote in The Plunder of Black America, Professor Schermerhorn, and you being a white person yourself, you've traveled the world, studied what it means to be white and conduct of white people throughout history. Do you think there are a substantial number of people classified as white who are often greatly and sincerely pained by racism? In fact, did you write about any such people in your book?
There aren't enough. And so that's the first response. And, you know, the people about whom I wrote, the white people about whom I wrote, are generally those who are standing ready to strip wealth and income value from Black Americans. And this is as old a story as the British colonies themselves. And so the book begins with Mary and Anthony Johnson. That's the identity that they took as free people of Angolan background on the eastern shore of Virginia, whose neighbors plundered them, whose neighbors looked for an opportunity to strip them of wealth. And so for most of the book, I do see that. There were a few people that tend to be recent immigrants who had a personal experience of generosity and kindness. So one of them is E. Harry Herscher, a Swiss-born architect who was in Phoenix in the late 1940s. And he saw a man named Lincoln Ragsdale on a street corner in Phoenix, and Ragsdale had just been to the last bank that wouldn't loan him anything, even though he was abundantly qualified for a small business loan. And Herscher, so Ragsdale in Phoenix, he's an ex-U.S. Army officer. He has property. He has a business plan. He has a very viable business plan, but no bank will lend to him in Phoenix. And so Herscher actually lent him the startup funds for the chapel in the valley, one of the first mortuaries that served African Americans and Latino Phoenicians. And so there are instances of that empathy. But when you ask about in general, I'd say sadly the answer is no.
That one is slick. Words are important. That one is slick, Professor Schermerhorn. If it had been a day where I hadn't had my caffeine or had been not rested, I would have accepted that. But I didn't ask about empathy. And even for Mr. Harrer giving that money or what have you, my question was about being sincerely and greatly pained about racism. There are lots, and you even include some, of white people. I just have to go back to get the name of the white fella. He contributed to the NAACP, but he still practiced racism, white supremacy, so he certainly was not greatly pained. So we might have an example of that here in Phoenix, yes?
Yeah, so good. Thanks for pressing hard on this. So yeah, the contributor to, I think, the NAACP or Urban League was Barry Goldwater, who, as U.S. Senator from Arizona, voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so I don't think that there, in the book's research, I didn't come across a lot of white Americans who were sincerely pained over this process. Now they do show up. They show up in government offices who are studying what they considered, the urban underclass, or whatever sociological name you want to put to this. And there are people who are sincerely fighting against the racial injustice and against white supremacy, as you've so powerfully phrased it here. But it doesn't seem to be widespread. And here's the test, and the book has this implicit test. If the injury over the last 400 years has been financial, shouldn't the solution be financial as well? That is, shouldn't we talk about restorative justice, reparations? Should we do something more than simply discuss it? Should we put some policy behind this? California's 2023 reparations task force went so far as to put a hard figure on individual Californians who have lived with housing discrimination, something like $160,000. That would be a tangible way of expressing outrage at this historic injustice.
Outrage? What kind of commie solution? You can see right now this book is not going to be well promoted. You're not going to get no big book tours. They're going to DEI you right on, maybe DEI you right on out of the country. Like, they got ICE folks to get rid of you. They're not doing no reparations. And where'd you get this communist dude from? We'll put a pin in that and come back to some of that later, but I appreciate the response, eventual honesty. And he did say, no, that's not really widespread. White people who are sincerely and greatly pained, it's plunder. That's what you see. White people plundering and exploiting black people all over the world. There's so many questions, because like I said, I was hoping this book was not going to be very good. Then I was disappointed because it was very good. So, one, was there a problem you were trying to solve with the plunder of Black America?
Yeah, well, what the book attempts to do is to put it in context, because when you see the economic data from an economist like William Darity Jr., Sandy Darity, that and the book From Here to Equality, I recommend everybody read. And he and co-author Kirsten Mullen take this history well in hand, but it moves very quickly. And what I try to do in The Plunder of Black America is to personalize it, to show not only that it's a thing, right, to the reading audience, but to see how forms of discrimination, forms of plunder reinforce one another. So when we talk about housing discrimination or employment or education discrimination or health inequities, it's not just the one thing that we can say, all right, which one of these is the right the right explanation. It's all of these reinforcing one another over time, with the added dimension that the plunder transforms. As Ta-Nehisi Coates says, it goes quiet. And so when we enter an age of algorithms and artificial intelligence that are spitting out credit scores that are can open the doors of opportunity, more often than not they close the doors, and they close it silently. And you could say, well, there's not a racist circuit in any server, right? So how can AI, which is not the person at the bank who's looking at the applicant for a loan, how can that AI be discriminatory? Well, if you train it on racist data and you train it on a history of discrimination and you train it to recognize people who live in predominantly Black neighborhoods as poor credit risks, then you start to repeat the process. We need to have a credit report for a rental application or a credit report for a job. Those things don't get you the house, they don't get you the job, but they can exclude you. And so this is how it happens now. You could say, well, to the extent that we normalize it, well, we're doing the same thing that we've been doing for centuries now, which is to say, well, this is just the thing. This is just inevitable. Or you start to blame the people who are denied the jobs, saying, well, they're not working, or denied the homes. Oh, they're living in substandard housing. There must be some reason why. rather than looking inward and saying it's a product of you choose not to use the word structural, but it's a product of a system that has many iterations over time.
For folks who are familiar with the work of Neely Fuller Jr., this is one where I would say maybe think, especially since he told us that this book was about context and looking at how this evolves, this plunder evolves over time so that you end up with a crime where there's not even evidence that the crime took place. Just what are you talking about? What? Nobody's been mistreated. We didn't steal anything. We didn't loot. What? Which is often about the way it goes. Like, what? Who took what? What are you talking about? But a big, the portion for Neely Fuller where he says the dedication to this and why this happens over years and years where it just evolves and you get new and refined ways of theft from black people. This is what people classified as white want. Meaning the setup that we have now, all these poor black people all over the world that can be blamed and taken advantage of and exploited and are vulnerable. This is what white people want. Fuller used to emphasize that all the time and specifically say this racism thing could be solved today. That's not what white people want. This is a great book to keep that in mind. Like, wow, you have to get to the, wait, before we even do that, man, this is another one I thought. Who was your intended audience for The Plunder of Black America? So is this supposed to be an academic book? Folks at Harvard and UVA are supposed to have this, or is this general population? Everybody go grab a copy of The Plunder of Black America and learn.
It's intended for everyone, and so it's intended for those people who would read the New York Times or the LA Times. It's intended for the a general audience. So a few years ago, I was giving a talk at a senior complex in Scottsdale, and the first clue I had to how tough this was I was in the elevator, and the gentleman turned to me and he says, "What are you doing here?" I didn't look like I was a resident, and I said, "Well, I'm going to give a talk on the racial wealth gap." And he just kind of straightened up and he said, "You're in the wrong place." And so I decided unabashedly, no, this is the right place. This is exactly the right place. This is wealthy white retirees who have time on their hands and want to hear a lecture on, injustice in America, and who have the means to fix it, maybe, or care deeply, as you put in the comments, right? But I got so much pushback from all sides, and so I'd had people who were in the financial services industry and saying, "Oh no, that can't possibly be right. There can't possibly be this disparate wealth among these groups." I'd have people who came up afterwards and saying that if you just adjusted the figures a little bit, the racial wealth gap would disappear because we're not taking into account the high taxes that white people pay or the transfer payments that are going to people of African descent. He didn't use those words, but that was the thrust of it. And so it was this whole kind of, it couldn't have been scripted better to say, actually, what you're saying is nonsense because I have an escape clause, right down to the person who said, I sympathize with these people you're talking about, but if they just played by the rules. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what's wrong? So that's when I thought I need to take some responsibility here as someone who has a privilege of being in, a teacher and being in a university, to try and reach a popular audience. And I think the way that you do that is through stories, right? Like you say, through context, through the concrete. And not only that, but to try to bring into view the stories of families that made it, that did better than their neighbors, that weren't victims, right? They overcame odds. Families like the Ragsdales in Phoenix, who were among the more wealthy African Americans, and maybe still are in this state. But yet to see what just completely, how vast the field of obstacles were, even for those very motivated, successful, upwardly mobile Black Americans.
our guest, author, Harvard graduate, Professor Calvin Schermerhorn. We have all these Harvard guests on here, and they use that word privilege, man. Like, if ever there is a time when the correct P word is power, a white man, Harvard graduate, wahoo wah, that's power. Yes? Don't you think that's more accurate than privilege?
Privilege and power, I think, are two sides of the same coin. So I'll agree with you there. Yeah.
I do not. I think power, the ability to get things done, is far more correct than privilege. Is very passive, as though there has not been plunder and active effort to acquire all of this. I think power and privilege are substantially. That's why white people don't use them interchangeably. We have tons, like hundreds, maybe 1,000 white people at this point. Privilege. Peggy McIntosh, she didn't write the white power NAPSA. That's not what she wrote. But anyway, he also said field of obstacles. Wow, words are so important. And that's one, because I said the context for this, because he said Arizona, even doubled down for John McCain. Doubled down. The context is, this is the land where white people, like that white fella who was about to call you a commie in the elevator, they didn't even want Dr. King's holiday. These are the white people who fought openly, staunchly. What I just said, he's a commie. What are you talking about? A holiday for that commie nigger? Are you serious? Ugh. We've talked about this repeatedly in John, and I think it was lots of prominent white people. I think John McCain was one. What? A king? That's error amongst lots of it. We can get to the rags there too, but I mean, woo, the context for this area and even what it means to be classified as white. Instead of field of obstacles, this is white people dedicated to racism, where they come up with all these lies. And the taxes, oh my God, I could pass out. Double whammy on that, because they got that chunky report I just mentioned. When it comes to the IRS and they get to auditing, they come for the Negro first. They got a big chunky 2023 report. Boop, just came out with that. The other end, you talk about two sides of the same coin. Who do they come and be? You got that in your book repeatedly, where they come and are so punitive with black people about taxes. Do you know who the biggest Brett Favre tax cheat in the galaxy? They have whole books about how white people, we're not going to pay no taxes. And in fact, especially if we think there might be a growing population of non-white people, woo, we are coming up with all kinds of schemes to not pay tax. Donald Trump. Oh my. Anyway, lots of context around all of that whole data. This is what we want. Like, what are you talking about? Coming here and you're in the wrong place, you commie. What? Anyway, getting to the book, you wrote, the accepted narrative of U.S. history has been a long march to freedom, the cadence of which slowed with the growth of slavery and quickened at emancipation. It faltered during the era of Jim Crow and found its footing again during the Civil Rights era. Over the last 40 years, the march got mired again and civil rights moved backward. Yet the stripping of black income and wealth has persisted even in those times of revolutionary steps forward. It has been so relentless that the stripping of black wealth has come to resemble an algorithm, intelligence, or rule set governing American economic development. Dare I say, a code. To bring to light that long process, it is helpful to think of it in three distinctive eras of dispossession, disinheritance, and decapitalization. Great starter to the book, and just that right there. I hear so many times that all this is white people ignorant and they don't know what they do. That is not this here book. This is, hey, we are very cognizant and we work over generations to take every nickel out of it. Matter of fact, this is set up, you niggers are not even supposed to have a nickel. And if you do get one, we're going to take it immediately. But for our listeners, and if you could break it down if you could break this down, Professor Schermerhorn, for people who have been denied school, don't get access to books, prison, pipeline from kindergarten, if you can break down these concepts for the concept of your book, dispossession, disinheritance, and decapitalization.
So thank you, Gus. The first era, the colonial era, was one of dispossession. That is, dispossession of health, of the value of labor, of family. And so you picture people who enslavers capture and land on the shores of British North America and later the United States in slave ships and are forced to work for their entire lives. So it's just the relentless taking, dispossessing of work product. This shifts as Black Americans have families, they raise children. And so what they get instead of just dispossession is disinheritance. That is, you don't get the work product that your parents labored for. Although the way of working ourselves up the social ladder in early America is on the backs of the previous generation. You inherit your parents' wealth, you inherit your parents' status, you inherit your parents' opportunities. And so this didn't happen for Black Americans. So you have generations starting at virtually zero wealth and then staying there. And at this time, you have programs that are boosting white wealth. We think about the relentless expansion, the extirpation of indigenous Americans, grabbing land, exterminating whole peoples. And this is an opportunity that's funded and provided by the federal government. After emancipation, this is supposed to be a new beginning, right? But instead, it's a reiteration of the old process, and this is decapitalization. So, like you say, every time a Black household or family gets a little bit of wealth, whites move to strip that wealth. And they invent things like real estate practices, and there's this whole sociology of real estate where it became axiomatic around the 1880s, 90s, into the early 20th century that Black occupancy lowers property value. Why is that? Well, like any racist theory, there's really no basis in reality. It's just as many people believe this, it starts to become something of a gospel in real estate circles. And so there you have the invention of the discriminatory practices in real estate, where you see in city after city, whether it's in Los Angeles or in Grand Rapids, Michigan, or Richmond, Virginia, cities in which you had people who had no restrictions on where they live suddenly being cornered into places of reinforcing disadvantage. And so this is decapitalization. So if you take things like the income gaps, where it takes an African American worker until Friday to earn what his white counterpart earned by Wednesday at lunchtime, you take that that income difference, you put that into real estate, where the fellow white worker is able to live in an up and coming area, a suburb, and that Black worker has to live in this ethnic enclave or racial enclave. And you think about the levers on opportunity for the next generation, right? Those suburban schools, those escalators to opportunity, versus what has happened here in the United States. We can also talk about this in a rural context as well. And so when we see this going on generation on generation, this is decapitalization. The middle class was made in the United States between 1930 and the late 1960s. And for most of that time, Black Americans were denied those opportunities. And so when we see today, aren't you going to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps? Martin Luther King famously said, right? It's a cruel jest to tell a bootless man to pull himself up by his bootstraps. And so we see this iterative process over and over. And instead of saying, well, the civil rights revolution, fixed that old injustice. What we've seen in the last 40 years since the Reagan Revolution is a new iteration of it. It's hard to spot as it's happening, or maybe it's not so hard to spot, but when we see that the paths upward are blocked, that is, the tolls on the on-ramps to opportunity are higher for Black Americans and intentionally higher, it's hard to think that, well, we have a narrative of progress here. This is not the American history that's taught in school.
James Lowen, this will be probably the one time that I mentioned that because of his answer. He said this isn't what they teach us in school. What he wrote in the book as well, lies my white teacher told. I said he need to put white in there because as his book spells out, they don't allow Black people to teach, certainly not white children, but lies my white teacher told me. And then certainly important for this book, sundown towns. It should be racially restricted regions. And what he said about in terms of real estate, the economics of white supremacy, racism, again, worldwide, it's not that, or the property values go down when Black people move. That is the economics of white people don't want to live around Black people. That's what that really is based in. It's not, other than racism, I mean, really being specific, because that doesn't get stated explicitly, although the data shows that throughout, and it doesn't matter if these are Black people that are not criminals, they don't do drugs, they graduated from school. White people do not want to live around Black people. So there you go. Black people move into the neighborhood property values. We don't want, and that's included in the book, and specifically that's included in the article. Now I can go back to the California article that I want to talk about anyway. Let's read. The damage from the Eden fire wasn't indiscriminate. The blaze that ravaged the city of Altadena, California in January 2025, killing 17 people and consuming over 9,000 buildings, destroyed Black Altadenans' homes in greatest proportion, not by accident. About 48% of Black-owned homes sustained major damage or total destruction, compared with 37% of those owned by Asian, Latino, or white Altadenans, according to a February 2025 report. I would love to see that disaggregated from the UCLA Ralph J. Bunche Center. What was the damage specifically for so-called Asians, specifically for so-called Latinos, and then white Altadenans? So let's see. What did this look like? What I expect, or whatever. The Eden fires, uneven devastation reveals a pattern of racial discrimination previously concealed along neat blocks of mid-century ranch-style homes and tree-lined streets. In the early 20th century, Altadena was a professional enclave connected to Los Angeles, 13 miles away by the Pacific Electric Railway, or Red Car System. It was also lily white, and that's how homeowner groups liked it, according to research by Altadena historian Michelle Zack. Is that a white woman?
I believe so, yeah.
I would think so too. These organizations, which had lofty names such as the Great Northwest Improvement Association and West Altadena Improvement Association, urged homeowners to write language into their deeds that would bar Black, Latino, or Asian tenants from buying or renting there. We want our section of Pasadena Rose Bowl and Altadena to be a place for white people only. And they don't even disaggregate to say wealthy white people, cool white people, blonde white people. White is right. We just don't want no niggers. They say rich nigger, no niggers. And that pattern continues today. It continues today, 2025, and it's worldwide. Am I being truthful, Professor Schermerhorn?
In a word, yes. And so, it will be telling how the recovery process works, because this was a community in Altadena that very self-consciously tried to keep Black people out, tried to keep Black Angelenos out. Ironically enough, or probably not for your listeners. The way that black buyers made their way into Altadena was because of a highway displacement in Pasadena, just to the south, where they built a interstate, I believe it's Interstate 210, connecting two valleys. And as we know that, these kind of highway improvement projects don't go through white neighborhoods, they go through black and Latino neighborhoods in just about every U.S. city. And so it displaced something like 4,000 families. And some of the pioneering black families who made it into Altadena were displaced because of the Pasadena, this highway project. And they were not able to buy into the larger lots neighborhood of the east side of Pasadena. They were buying in smaller homes on smaller lots in West Pasadena. And so here's where the historic income and wealth gap sets up this unnatural disaster of 2025. Where you had pioneering families who are coming in, they're buying houses that are closer together. There had always been an acute fire risk in Altadena. I mean, this is going back, when the city was ranch land. Everyone knew this was a fire-prone area. Then one of the other factors, as you mentioned, is this persistence of overtaxing, underassessing black-owned properties, with this racist idea that black property ownership or occupancy lowers the value. So there's this kind of weird correlation between overtaxing, underassessing, and then saying, well, the property is worth less because it's black occupied. But the combined stresses of lower income, of higher taxes, higher insurance, higher cost of borrowing, meant that black Altadenans could buy less house for their money. And so over time now, as this area goes up in value, we see that there was fewer and fewer black households in Altadena as a whole, and the residents tended to be older. They tended to be less able to do those kind of fire prevention activities, that clearing brush, clearing those kinds of incendiaries from this ember, from what's going to be an ember fire that spreads through embers blown by the Santa Ana winds. And so when you add all this up, it would be very hard, I think, to draw another conclusion about the history of racism in Altadena and the incidence of severe and catastrophic fire damage from the Eaton fire in 2025.
Super important in terms of what Professor Schermerhorn said about this area. Even the name Santa Ana, I think that translates Satan's winds. It's been a very long time that this area has been fire-prone for the exact winds that they talked about. When it's dry and it hasn't rained and it's been drought, all of these are weather conditions that are being exacerbated by climate change. But all of that has been the case for a while, and apparently it's getting worse. That's the sort of thing that I point to and say, now, since there is such an extraordinary information gap, which is so well documented in the plunder of Black America, you would have a lot of people who are classified as white. They would know this, that, we have got these Negroes in a total fire trap. It's unincorporated. The houses are close together. They're older, too. That came up with people not being able to evacuate and confusion about the alert.
Correct.
There would be white people who would already know, like years and maybe before Rodney King, like, those Negroes are, and if we want it, we can just wait for the fire and then we can get the property back because we've already seen how this rebuild is going to go. Katrina, which we talked about in depth, Louisiana, that's one of the areas of study in the book. We've already seen how this looks. We can get that property back quickly. Were you going to add?
No, that's it. I mean, whether you're talking about Houston in the wake of Hurricane Harvey or southern Louisiana, the Gulf Coast, really, in the wake of Katrina, it wasn't just the lower Ninth. It was Kenner. It was Gulfport. It was lots of it was the whole area. And then in the rebuilding, as I'm sure you've covered, the population is older, it's whiter, and the people who got the insurance payouts who were able to stay and rebuild tended to be white, and those who are permanently displaced tended to be black. And that's probably what we're going to see in Altadena as well.
Lots of that was happening even before the fire, where black people who lived there were reporting and trying to stave this off. So I would just expect this to be accelerant. Isn't that the term they use sometimes? So,
right.
Getting back to that's why I said, like, I really wanted to talk about California, but man, the book was so good. It's like I would be, perhaps, what is that, a pleasant disappointment that I was thinking the book was not going to be very good. So we just like, oh, okay, Plunder, and then, wow. So what was so good in the book? Page 16, Mary and Anthony Johnson. In fact, before I do that, because I've never seen a book formatted or sectioned in this manner, where it's kind of you're following different families and groupings, and mostly black people, and how they have been stripped, terrorized in the system, financially terrorized in the system of white supremacy. Like, can you kind of share with, like, the chapter I'm about to read from, Mary and Anthony Johnson? Why did you decide to group it and focus it in that manner?
Mary and Anthony Johnson left some of the most prominent records of any Angolan family in 17th century colonial Virginia. And so I'm not the first to research them, but the reason I chose them was because they were among the wealthiest African descended Virginians in their time and place. They petitioned courts. There was a black tax that fell on African women. Virginia passed this tax in 1643 and reiterated it for the rest of the century. And the Johnson family actually petitioned the county court and won. And the court said, in essence, oh yeah, since you've been here over 30 years, we're going to treat you and your daughters like they were white Virginia women. And so I thought, okay, this is not something I'm really making up. This is something that's right there in black and white in the historical record. It's also the case that after Anthony Johnson died without a will, the court came in, and the probate court actually gave as a reason that he was a Negro and therefore an alien, and that's why we're taking his property. So there wasn't any gray area there, right? They just came, and they said it again when they took his son's property. They took Richard Johnson's property, saying, yes, because Anthony Johnson was a Negro and by consequence an alien, and that's the language they used. And so here was a family that did everything right. They worked their way out of captivity, out of enslavement, out of bondage. They moved, they ranched, they planted tobacco. They even enslaved at least one other African-descended man, John Casor. They did this because in that day and time, that time and place, if you wanted land, you had to have labor first. The colony granted you head rights. And so they claimed Casor. They also claimed some other white servants for land. So they did everything that you would expect of a Virginia gentle family, if you like. And for most of Anthony Johnson's career, the colony recognized him as a planter first and a black man second. That changed in the 1660s. It changed for many reasons, but to simplify the story, they decided to draw a color line. And on one side, we're going to be property owners. On the other side, we're going to be people who are construed as property. And the more enslaved people there were, the more captive Angolans there were in Virginia, the more the Johnson family looked less and less like planters and more like enslaved people.
Page 16 in the Plunder of Black People, you have Plunder of Black America, Plunder of Black America. Page 16. But even as Mary and Anthony's family and household grew, the legal chains of slavery were growing tighter in Virginia and making life more difficult for people of African descent. The relationships between English colonialists and Africans became more stringently regulated. In 1630, Margaret Cornish, an Ndongo woman who had also arrived on one of the two pirate ships that intercepted Mary's slave ship years before, was convicted of fornication for having sex with Hugh Davis, an Englishman. The court ordered Davis to be soundly whipped before an assembly of Negroes and others for defiling his body in lying with a Negro, a worse punishment than one usually given for fornication. In 1640, a James City court convicted Cornish of fornication with Robert Swett, a white planter, ordering Swett to appear in a white sheet and carry a white stick in public penance at James City Church, while the said Negro woman, Cornish, shall be whipped at the whipping post with 30 lashes. In 1640, when 3 bound laborers, 1 black, 1 Dutch, and 1 Scottish, ran away from their masters, Virginia's General Court in Jamestown sentenced the white servants to an added year each of service to the owner, plus 3 years each as bond servants to Virginia, while John Punch, being a Negro, shall serve his said master for the time of his natural life here in Virginia or elsewhere. Wahoo-wah indeed. I was fascinated by this. I thought this was so important for so many reasons, but this, you don't even have a United States of America at this point. That is way down the road at this point. Already, it is being codified. System of white supremacy, racism, what it means to be white, what it means to be Negro, and sexual activity. We are going to have rules about, and I even get one of my favorite truisms of white supremacy, racism, counter-racist logic from the great Neely Fuller Jr. He said, white people cannot be ignorant about white supremacy, racism. Why? You will get in trouble with other white people. Now, I don't know if he said you're going to get whipped publicly in front of niggers, but you will get in trouble with other white people if you are messing up about what is expected of you as a white woman, white man, white child. With this section specifically, can you speak to this? Is codification of sexual activity, and you as a white person, there are certain rules you are supposed to know. You are not supposed to be having sexual intercourse with a black person, certainly not marriage or nothing of the sort, and this gets codified. I mean, this is more than 100 years before the USA comes into existence. I think that is massively important. Can you speak to that?
Correct, and these are warning shots, if you like. At least one of the Johnson children, I think it was Richard Johnson, married an English woman, married a white woman, and in that time and place, there were these court cases, but Virginia didn't pass any bans on interracial marriage until 1691. It only becomes an issue, right, in the later part of the 17th century. So in the 1650s, when the children of these Angolan former captives, now planters, are on the marriage market, they look pretty good. And they look really good to any suitable English or African descended women. But that changes, and it changes for the reasons that you described there. In order to create and reify white supremacy, you have to have rules that whites follow, and they have to follow it strictly, right, to make racial difference and interracial marriage a crime. So this is among the changes that are happening, and you can see that this is how colonial America is built. This is the formation of American society. And so once you start making those distinctions, once you start writing them into law, once the courts start recognizing them, and it becomes that once they start drawing that color line, it's very, very difficult to dismantle, especially because it tends to work well for people like the Parkers, the neighbors of the Johnson family, who repeatedly preyed on them and eventually took their land.
Repeatedly preyed on them and eventually took their land. That could be the title of the book as well. Like, woo, man. Context of white supremacy, indeed. And just to show the continuity, I'll shut up and read so you can see the continuity of this. So this is page 24, same chapter, Mary and Anthony Johnson. Virginia strangled, verbiage, whew, Virginia strangled black upward economic mobility. The legislature passed strict penalties for any English indentured servant who made common cause with an enslaved African. Legally, Christian now designated white Virginians only. In 1667, the Virginia legislature clarified that baptism would not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. Chesapeake leaf glutted the London market, lowering prices, but English law forbade planters to sell on the open market, which thus hurt families like the Johnsons. In the early 1660s, John and Susanna Johnson suffered successive setbacks in the tobacco market, and they were forced to sell part of their 550-acre estate to a Dutch buyer in 1664. George Parker ramped up his accusations of sex crimes against John Johnson, and in 1665, Northampton County prosecuted him for adultery and fathering a child with Hannah Leach, an English indentured servant bound to Anne Toth. But adulterous relationships and children out of wedlock were not unheard of in Northampton. Edmund Scarborough carried on an extramarital affair with Anne Toft, who bore 3 of his children, while John Johnson was said to have been in a relationship with Hannah Leach. Yet the court punished a black man for adultery, while it turned a blind eye to the same offense committed at the same time by 2 white property owners. After repeated accusations from Parker, the Northampton court ruled that Johnson appeared incorrigible in committing the sin of fornication and sentenced him to an indefinite incarceration at the county's workhouse. It made him pay child support for Leach's baby and court costs, and he had to post a bond for good behavior to get out of prison. Whoa. Like, man, I mean, now, Ken, maybe I shouldn't be that staggered about this, because, I mean, wow, we have heard this in Emmett Till and O.J. Simpson. Okay, we got it. Black dudes and raping white men. But, I mean, dang, this is like, there is no USA that is still, like, more than 100 years away. And even at this prehistoric date, you know, that nigger's been messing around with that white woman. Guilty. And that, like, woo! I mean, I just, wow. Wow. Can you, extra details you could add to this one, Professor Schermerhorn?
Yeah, so there was no question in the court's mind that, in the court records, I should say, I can't peer into their mind. There's no question in the court records that this was consensual, that these were 2 consenting adults, and this is not a crime. But what you're describing here is the origins of the myth of, you know, unrestrained, black men's sexuality on white women that's going to be taboo. That's going to be the pretext for thousands of lynchings and the whole stereotype. The reason why the Ku Klux Klan rides to glory in the night. You know, that sort of mythology of white supremacy. So yeah, you're certainly seeing that. And I also want to mention in the book that it's not confined to Virginia. So a lot of times there's an alibi for American racism, which is to say, well, it was a product of the South. And if we can just kind of bring ourselves to look north, look to the great egalitarian North, we'll get ourselves out of this. But that alibi doesn't work, because by the time you get to chapter 2, we're talking about New England and the Venture Smith family, and how Megan Venture Smith's enslavers were stealing the equivalent of many lifetimes of earning from them in places like Connecticut and on Fisher's Island in New York. So yeah, so I'm jumping ahead here, but yeah, this is a formative stage of American society, and this is, as you mentioned, this is over 100 years before the American Revolution.
Foundation of the country, so-called. Lying. Got these raping niggers. Something got to be done. Woo! Never gets old. Jumping, you were right where I was, chapter 2, Venture and Meg Smith in New England. We don't want to think that this is just some, southern thing where just Virginia and Louisiana do bad by the dark folks. This is on bottom of page 31. You write, in New England, African descended people made up 3% of the overall population, but 1 in 4 New England families enslaved at least one black person. And they were concentrated in coastal towns. Even on New England plantations, enslaved people faced the same income inhibiting and wealth stripping strategies as their southern counterparts. Pious New Englanders regarded theirs as a land of gospel light, but they did not oppose slavery. Newport, Rhode Island had one of the largest slaving fleets in the Atlantic. The slavery business saturated the coastal economy. Thought that one was super important as well, and in fact, Congregationalists talked of redemption as deliverance from sin, but Venture understood redemption as deliverance from enslaver-imposed debt. Thompson Stanton brought Venture from George Mumford in 1754 to capture his growing earning potential. The Stonington native was a farmer and merchant in the West Indies molasses trade. He bled Venture twice to ensure maximum earnings from his bondsman's toil. Stanton purchased Meg and Hannah from the Mumford family for the Connecticut equivalent of 70 pounds sterling. If Venture stepped out of line, Stanton could punish his wife and child or keep them from him, which gave him little choice but to cooperate. Skipping down a couple paragraphs, Thomas Stanton took pleasure in Venture's torment. He made him fetch a barrel of molasses, Venture recalled, which weighed hundreds of pounds. Stanton ordered me to carry it on my shoulders over 2 miles. The cruel task encapsulated New England slavery on Venture's predicament. Molasses was a sugar byproduct grown and processed by enslaved people of African descent in the Caribbean or West Indies and Brazil. Yet New England was known for molasses the way 20th century Seattle would be known for coffee, concealing the blood, sweat, and tears that made it molasses saturated New England cuisine in recipes like molasses dumplings, gingerbread, donuts, and anadma bread. New England distilleries turned molasses into rum, much of it used to pay for captives in African markets like Anamabu. New Englanders poured rum liberally into drinks like Stone Fence and Syllabub, which contained blended cream, sugar, rum, and wine or cider. I will stop there. The #1 book for this here broadcast, Delectable Negro. That is all of it from beginning to end right there. And the consumption, finger-licking consumption of black people in so many ways. Wow. Just what to say. I guess if we could get slavery in New England, he said 1 in 4 owned Negroes. Very important. I don't think we think of New England as being saturated with white slave owners in that capacity, but with the rum specifically. And that, are you familiar with the book, The Delectable Negro: Human Consumption and Homoeroticism in U.S. Slave Culture? Do you know that book, Vincent Woodard?
No.
That is the #1 book in terms of my understanding of racism, white supremacy, and detailing. But at that passage right there, you could pick it up and plunk it right down in delectable Negro. Because, I mean, wow. That concealing the blood, and I wouldn't even say consuming the blood, sweat, and tear. I mean, everything that we eat and drink. And white people know where this rum came from. This is the blood of Negroes and all the rest. Wow, that is, all of that is just so and the consumption, even this whole book, Plunder, the consumption. We get to decide if you're going to eat. We get to prey on you and lie and just make up rules to steal everything. And then the enjoyment, even that, before we get to the donuts and all of that, he said he would make me pick, because that's in delectable Negro too. He'd make me pick up this barrel of molasses that weighs more than I do. I'm malnourished. And make me carry it for miles, often for no reason, just to chuckle at me and torture me as a slave. That, right, is exactly a part of the consumption that Vincent Woodard talks about. And you mentioned that a few times, that, I mean, this stripping and plunder, I mean, yeah, it's economics, but I mean, a lot. That's why I asked that question about, do you see any evidence of people classified as white that they have some sort of great sadness, sorrow, pain about all of this? That's not what I see at all. This is, Negro, get that barrel of molasses. Now walk 5 miles. And then you get there and bring it back. What was all this for?
Yeah.
Shut up. And then you get up and do the same thing tomorrow. That is not greatly pained. That is not empathy. It's boatloads of this all throughout the book. Am I being truthful?
That is correct. And my students sometimes say, well, why would they do that? If you're an enslaver, wouldn't you want to protect your investment? But the actual logic of it is as you say, the pain is the point, the degradation is the point. Making Venture Smith do that, then tear the fibers of his muscles and stretch the sinews and tax the bones, and cause all that psychic anguish, while his wife and kids are under the thumb, under the lash of the same man, is that essential point. That's the cruelty. And so it's not as if all the townspeople of Stonington, Connecticut, who saw this spectacle empathized, or that they didn't seem to connect with Venture Smith. And those people who did tended to be ones who would take advantage of him, to say, hey, if you're carrying that molasses barrel for him, I bet you could carry it farther for me. and that's what ended up happening. That's how Venture Smith became Venture Smith. He became owned by an enslaver, also Smith, who bled him. He used him as a cash machine. He said, I'm going to charge you an extraordinary amount for your freedom, and then for your wife and kids' freedom. And this was the drama of Venture's adult life, of enslaver after enslaver, white man after white man, bleeding him for income. And that's why the story of Venture and Meg Smith is tragic, because they made it. They made it out of enslavement. By 1775, 250 years ago this year, they were free property owners up the Connecticut River in Connecticut, and we rightfully celebrate that. But they would have been millionaires in their time and place had it not been for the enslavers who treated him as a cash cow, as an income machine. And his first son Solomon died for it when a duplicitous hiring agent put him aboard a whale ship, and he died of scurvy at sea. And the man showed no remorse for it. Didn't even give Venture the promised silver buckles that he'd enticed this 16-year-old Solomon Smith with for signing up for this voyage. And so this is New England, right? This is the same New England that produced John Adams and a host of other revolutionaries. This is the same New England that we can, we look to with the Mayflower and the Puritans and the city upon a hill. So if we could put this city upon a hill, maybe we can capture a little bit of the momentum of events that formed American history.
Context of white supremacy. What does it mean to be white? Even his name, Venture. Ugh, man, like everything about you is going to be exploitation, bleeding. That's a delectable Negro consumption. And about his son as well on the whaling ship. She said he didn't even get the money. His son goes out and dies on all of this. Lied to. Anyway, I'm just skipping down a couple pages. This is the bottom of 45. You write, Cuff Smith struggled in the post-war economy. He worked in a quarry near Haddam, and by the mid-1790s, his family was desperate for food and fuel. One winter, he stole firewood from a neighbor, taking 1 or 2 logs at a time until he had walked off with 2 cords of seasoned oak. The court fined him 40 shillings and ordered he be publicly whipped on his naked body. That is in delectable Negro. He has it in quotes for emphasis on his naked body. They talk about that delectable Negro. That is a part of being a slave. You can't even control if I have a shirt or pants that white people control, if you can even go out threadbare, buck naked, as they say. And then got to be beaten, of course, and the sexual component of that homoeroticism, slave culture. It continues an excessive punishment, but that's common with the Negro, before slavery and afterwards. When 3 white men attacked, beat, and robbed his father, the same court fined them 22 shillings and 1 penny, just over £1 Connecticut money. It fined Cuff nearly twice that amount and flogged him in town square for maximum humiliation. Hear it again. Venture disowned his son after the firewood incident. It was harsh and petulant, but after a lifetime of sacrifices, he viewed Cuff's transgression as a threat to the fragile security of a black family in a hostile republic. He moaned that neither Cuff nor Solomon had walked in the way of their father. Venture Smith died in 1805 at age 77 after 51 years of marriage. Meg died in 1809 at 79. Solomon ordered headstones and arranged the burials at First Congregational Church of East Haddam. The grave markers still stand. Are you serious? Solomon also obeyed his father's wish to prevent Cuff's burial in the family plot. I could have cried. Woof. I mean, at this time, I'm going to guess you do not have central heat. I could be wrong. But, man, I have not been to New England in the wintertime. I don't love Tom Brady that much. I think you could have probably died. If you don't have a fire, I don't know what their residents look like, but I suspect New England winter circa 18th century, you can't get firewood, you might die. I could be wrong. I've never experienced it, but I mean, wow, you get stripped naked, beaten, you got to pay all this back, and then you get dumped from your family. And so importantly, why do I get dumped? Because it's dangerous. In a system of white supremacy, they might associate you, wood thief, with us, which they will anyway. So get on away from around here, even in death. I could, for firewood. It's not like he was stealing corn liquor or firewood. Woo! I could have cried. Did you comment, Professor Schermerhorn?
Yeah, that's two things. So it shows how terrified Venture Smith was of his son getting on the wrong side of that that white supremacy. And then it does show the importance of this firewood. I mean, this is like stealing somebody's central heating unit, right? And he probably needed the firewood as well. But it just shows that, as you mentioned, this disparate so-called justice system. And I don't know what explains Venture Smith disowning his son for this, but it doesn't fit the crime, if you like, right? And again, if we look back, if we isolate an instance like this, and you'll say, well, yeah, he was a thief. Cuff Smith was a thief. But look back and see what was going on in the previous generation. Again, his father, he was enslaved. His father earned something like 50 years worth of income that enslavers took from him. And so it's like, well, there are crimes and there are crimes. Nobody was ever punished for that. Nobody was held accountable because enslavement was legal. And it was also an accepted part of the system that you described, right? The system of white supremacy. But the humiliation was the point, right? Disparate punishment was the point. Some white assailants rob Bencher Smith and they get a slap on the wrist, but Cuff Smith steals some firewood and, there's hell to pay.
Even in death, there is hell to pay. Like, man, I could have cried. Yeah. And if anything, that is the fear of white people. I mean, wow, I might have to turn my own son out even in death because I am terrified of white people, and rightly so.
And rightly so. And then you could see what your trajectory is for Cuff Smith. Here is somebody who was he was a patriot, right? He was on the side of the American Revolution. But what kind of economy did he inherit? Well, the economy was pretty bad after the revolution. But what changed? What changed as a result? The book wants to argue that instead of seeing things like the American Revolution as a revolutionary event, it was for white Americans who became closer, especially white men who became involved in the Republic as citizens instead of subjects of a distant king. But it didn't transform the fortunes of Cuff Smith. It didn't transform the descendants of Megan Bencher into economic citizens, into people who had, the full rights and privileges, who were able to, go out and pursue their own happiness on their own terms. So we can see just how much this dispossession became disinheritance. They inherited blackness. They inherited this was the main inheritance from the generation that was enslaved. And even though Cuff was free, right? You read the passage. You described the consequences of this, of transgressing that color line.
In New England, not on a Georgia or Louisiana slave plantation. This is Tom Brady's New England, and they're stripping and lashing black folks in public for stealing a log of wood. This one stood out to me massively. I'm moving a little bit forward in the text. This is chapter Morris on page 61 of the Plunder of Black America. Where you write, enslavers plundered roughly 2 pounds of every 3 pounds in black labor value. Not every white or free person benefited, but owners like Washington, George, who enslaved hundreds of bondspersons, stripped thousands of pounds worth of slave labor value each year. Some of those transfers were written in blood. Super important, but I had to go back to that second sentence. Not every white or free person benefited. Which group of white people did not benefit from the system of white supremacy racism?
Good question. Yes, the intent was to say that if you looked at the sort of chain of value going from the work product that black people like Morris generated, right? You cannot link every white person in Fairfax County to that theft. But the point you're making is equally valid, which is that the wages of whiteness were benefited every white person in Fairfax County or Virginia or the United States at that time. So yeah, the thrust of Boris's chapter was to try and show kind of the network of people who are preying on his income, from George Washington, whose wife's estate owned him, to all the people whom Morris served. But the broader point still holds, right? The wages of whiteness were considerable.
Have you read Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told?
Yes. Yeah.
That one of my, I think that one begrudgingly might be in our top 10 too, even though that was kind of an accidental read. But I was going to go back and get, because he has so many passages where I remember the review, they were so upset about that book because they said, man, this Baptist dude, who is a white man, this Baptist dude wrote this book, and he makes it seem like all white people are racist. So then you go and you read the book. Oh man, that is what it seems like. Yes, all white people, somehow, some way, they are participating in this system of white supremacy racism. Now, he's talking about the slavery era, but he goes in detail, and he makes the same point that you end up coming to later in the book. That, in fact, the only reason I didn't go to get the passage from Baptist's book is I said, oh, he has some of the similar passages in your book where Baptist, he says the Negro, that is the bank in this part of the world, like for centuries, directly, indirectly, whether you own a plantation or not, the Negro is the bank for this part of the world. So then as I continue reading, it's like, oh, he does. Let me start picking out some of the passages where you basically make the same point where, yes, all of these white people in some way. Here we go. Let's see. He writes, so this is Martha Bentley, page 77. At 12 years old, Martha said goodbye to her mother. John Martin took her to Cincinnati, 500 miles north, together with two half-siblings, Martin's offspring by another enslaved woman, rape. As an enslaver, he stood to profit by Martha Bentley's perpetual enslavement, but John Martin chose instead to clear a path to freedom for some children whom he fathered yet refused to recognize as his children. Martha Bentley was genetic offspring, but not an heir. By contrast, Martin sent his white daughter, Eliza Mary, to Georgia Female College, now Wesleyan College, in Macon. He paid for private educations for his sons, John and Robert, but in taking Martha to Cincinnati, he evaded Southern state laws against teaching children like Martha Bentley literacy. In 1829, Georgia passed an anti-literacy law that punished anyone who taught a black child to read or write with whipping and prison. Several other southern states followed, so that by the 1840s, most black Americans lived in states that outlawed basic education for African-descended people. That is not the all-white people benefit passage that I wanted, but that is in all caps on my page because, wow, that right there is one of the massive themes of this book. I just said it's in all capital letters. The deliberate, willful effort on the part of white people, and this is collective. This is one, Gus, you being so broad and general. Yep. Because when I asked before, I said, so where are the white people who don't participate in this? Crickets.
Right.
So white people deliberately and on a widespread scale and for generations all across the country, north, south, everywhere, white people deliberately worked. We are going to make sure these Negroes are as ignorant as possible. How do you dominate people forever? You keep them ignorant. We'll kill you if you teach them how to read. You don't get no books. You don't get to go to school. Aggressively, you see white people at every corner aggressively work. You all are going to be ignorant. You're going to be ignorant about everything. That's, oh, God, this, we just read this. In silence or indifference, that's the exact same thing Dr. Wayne Wiegand, white man, his book just was published a couple months before your book, Professor Schermerhorn, white man also, where that's the whole theme of the book, how white people deliberately practiced racism to keep black people to restrict their access to public libraries, access to books, ability to read, all of that. You want to make sure you keep people slaves forever? Keep them stupid. And this just stacks over. I was stunned at how often this just, one more time. In Cincinnati, John Martin hired a guardian for the 3 children to whom he paid 1 year's tuition in advance and money for shoes, Bentley recalled. We had clothes enough. To his children, he left a stern warning to marry neither a white man nor a black man. If I should, he would take me back south and put me on the farm. In the rebuilding after the 1829 terror, Cincinnati churches opened schools for black pupils since then. This is Ohio, not Louisiana, not Mississippi, not Georgia. Ohio, John Boehner rolling over in his grave. In Cincinnati, the situation was so Cincinnati churches opened schools for black pupils since the city forbade black and white students to attend the same schools. The situation was so fraught that whites burned black schools in some parts of Ohio. They didn't say churches, they said they burned black schools. And voters exempted black residents from paying certain taxes in order to silence the outcry over black exclusion from public schools. I didn't cry, but oh man. Now you have already heard overtaxation is a theme of white supremacy racism. Carl Andrews told us, you don't even know that. The half has never been told. He said, you don't even know the half on the overtaxation because white people make it hard to access that data. So it's probably astronomical and on so many different layers. But that to have that context, the whites in Ohio are so dedicated to keeping the niggers ignorant. We will let you not pay some taxes so you'll stop whining about being excluded from public education. Wow. Let me continue because this one stacks. Let me get one more just because it's so much. This is a big theme of the book. This is how you want to physically exploit people. I mean, financially, physically exploit people. You keep them stupid. Let me get one more and then one more. This is on page 104, Harriet and Jack Adams. After its initial rescue phase, the HOLC partnered with local real estate groups to produce maps of urban real estate markets that assess lending risk and further disadvantaged black homeowners. As in other locales, the HOLC divided Grand Rapids, Michigan, into 4 grades of residential housing: A, B, C, and D. A areas were blocks of typically new and well-planned sections of the city, populated by white families in neighborhoods under construction. The second grade was completely developed and likened to a good used car. Grade C designated mature neighborhoods where properties needed upkeep or had mixed architectural styles. The HOLC encouraged good mortgage lenders to be more conservative, lending to owners on C blocks than those on A or B graded blocks. Grade D areas were marked in red, redlined, and off limits to good loans because of an undesirable population or infiltration of it, along with a high proportion of rental properties and unstable incomes. The difference between C and D often came down to the presence of African Americans. In November 1936, Sarah Hilliard opened her front door to a pair of inspectors assessing the Hilliards' property for the Valley City Building and Loan Association and Grand Rapids Homestead Association. They did not like what they saw. The house needed repairs, and Sarah and Lunsford Hilliard were black. The HOLC redlined the Hilliards' block, as did every other black block in Grand Rapids and in every urban African American neighborhood across the nation. The inspectors reported that 715 Henry Avenue was in poor condition and pegged its market value at $2,200, about 36% of its 1930 value. Sarah's inheritance practically vanished in that assessment. And I will stop there. That's not the reading one I wanted, but I'll stop there just for pause. But I think that's such a massive theme in the text. Can you speak to the consistent, deliberate effort on the part of whites to keep black people stupid?
Yeah, so you've hit on 2 big themes there, and that if we're talking about things like intergenerational wealth, intergenerational wisdom, intergenerational goods, and transfers of things, what do we get from our parents and from our grandparents, right? We get their wisdom, we get their opportunities that transmit down. If you prevent a generation and then another generation and another generation of from going to school, from education, you deprive the grandparents of an education, you deprive the parents of the opportunity to build wealth or to access those careers that require education. Then by the time you get to the grandkids, you've essentially trapped them, cornered them in Grand Rapids. And to connect the dots here, Sarah Hilliard was the great-grandchild of Martha Bentley, this woman who was kidnapped in New Jersey, taken south to Georgia, subject to rape. Her daughter. I'm talking about Harriet Bentley. Her daughter Martha Bentley is the one who went to Cincinnati. She eventually escaped to Canada, where she met and married another fugitive from American slavery, Henry Goings. Together they had 5 children. 4 of those 5 children ended up in Grand Rapids after the Civil War. One of them, Sam Goings, actually served in uniform in the Civil War. And so that Harriet Adams was the father of Sarah Hilliard, whose house was redlined. And so what we see here, instead of an intergenerational transfer of advantage and wealth, kind of this American dream, yes, your grandparents might have been farmers, but you work in an office and drive a nice car and live in the suburbs, we have this cycle of dispossession, disinheritance, decapitalization, so that the goods that the inheritance, the first inheritance in this Goings family, the first cash inheritance was to Sarah Hilliard. But here she was boxed into this less than a square mile enclave of now it was going to be concentrated African-American poverty. And you could say, well, the building inspectors showed up and they saw this house that was dilapidated. What they didn't see was the fact that because segregation happened block by block in Grand Rapids, just like it happened block by block in so many other cities, that this put pressure on African-American homeowners to subdivide a single-family home to provide shelter for other black households, for other black families who couldn't rent anymore in other parts of the city. And so that's exactly what Sarah and her husband Lunsford did. They doubled up, and that's going to put more wear and tear on a structure. And so segregation wasn't just cutting off individual families, or redlining wasn't just cutting off the lending to individual households. It was also these pressures, this intense pressure to solve the artificial housing shortage by doubling the number of occupants in many of these homes. And so you saw this in the Goings family as well. And so you start to accumulate these facts, and it's almost unavoidable that this system of white supremacy produces these results, this very deliberate result of decapitalization. And the other thing that's not mentioned here are the limited employment opportunities that Sarah and her husband Lunsford had in Grand Rapids, which was an epicenter of the U.S. Industrial Revolution. The label "Made in Grand Rapids" that designated fine furniture. There were hundreds of industrial designers. There's still a lot of furniture factories there today. But there were automobile companies. There was Electrolux. There was the Nash Calvinator Company. There were all these other industrial enterprises, but none of them hired black people. You could only get hired in service industries, maybe Kroger or Herpelsheimer's department store. There was the Paramarquette Railroad that hired just one African-American manager by 1940. But the career ladder was artificially short. And so if you put together generations and generations of denials of education, of enforced like limited options. I don't want to say ignorance, because these were not ignorant people, but they did not have the credentials that started to open the door because they weren't white. And so by the time you get to the 1950s, when sociologists are looking around and going, oh, there's an urban ghetto, it is not the product of the people who live there. It's a product of this force in American history, where the book takes those steps from colonial Virginia to the revolution in Massachusetts to the ordeals of people like Martha Bentley. And then you can see, right, Sarah Hilliard and the extreme difficulty any black family had in building wealth and giving a better life to the next generation.
Not even supposed to happen by design. Fuller used to say that all the time as well, talking about passing on that the disinheritance, major theme of the text. Neely Fuller, same person white people cannot be ignorant about racism. He used to say all the time, you are not supposed to get that second generation house, and I saved this up for you, and all that. That's not supposed to happen. We're supposed to take all of that. You're supposed to be, what he told us for, you, Junior, are supposed to be starting at 0. And if you get Leroy the Third, you are supposed to be starting at 0. And we just continue with that the whole way through. And in fact, he said, I wouldn't call these people ignorant. It's not a put down or what have you, although there's lots of that. I mean, racists are the master name callers. But yes, these people are. Harvard is not overrun with the ancestors of the Rivers family, the Ragsdales. That's not what's on the campus of Harvard. Or, hey, I am a UVA alumnus, but it was not no tons of people that look like me running around on TJ's campus. Like, get out of here. At bottom of 116, that was the one I meant to read for education. To ensure a supply of cheap black labor, South Carolina defunded schools serving African American students, thereby depriving the rising generation of their parents' opportunities. In 1880, about when Hector and Tara's son Sam Rivers started school, South Carolina spent $2.51 per year to educate a black student compared to $2.75 per year to educate a white pupil. By the time Sam's younger brother Alex was approaching school age, Redeemer politicians argued that black students were ignorant, deadheads, who consumed more than they paid in taxes. Probably the other way around. By 1895, South Carolina spent $1.05 per year per black student and $3.11 per year white pupil. White supremacists argued that to educate a Negro is to spoil a laborer and train up a candidate for the penitentiary, and moaned that it is wrong to tax the white people to educate African Americans. Slashing education to over half the state's students destroyed human capital and ensured that the next generation would be worse off than their parents. Alex Rivers and his younger siblings had virtually no formal schooling and entered adulthood barely literate. What I just said, Wayne Wiegand, in silence or indifference. That is not no coincidence. That is exactly what we white people intended. He wrote a whole book about it, and that right there, that's what I say. If you're illiterate, why do you not qualify for ignorant? What's the problem with saying somebody that's illiterate is ignorant? I mean, isn't that true? You don't want to be 2025. You do not want to be illiterate. You for sure are going to be ignorant. They got real ID laws that are about to kick in. If you are illiterate, you might not even be aware that that's taking place. Am I being logical?
You are. It's just that when I was researching the Gullah people, there was such a rich tradition of how they know and how they understand the world. And so I'm thinking there's, I didn't want to try to reduce lack of schooling to ignorance, but the conditions, certainly it translated into economic disadvantage. And even that figure about the disparate funding, that even understates the disparities, because where Alex Rivers and where Johnny Rivers grew up on Thomas Island, outside of Charleston, South Carolina, there wasn't any schools, right? It's not just that the state is underfunding a segregated school system, they just didn't have schools. And so that's off the table. So that's part of the equation too. Even if they had the implacable drive to education, it just wasn't available for them. And this was state policy. And so if we want to talk about reparations and restorative justice, this might be a good avenue to travel down, because this is something that's debated in the legislature, that's a product of state budgets. It's an intentionally segregated school system, and the evidence is clear, right? South Carolina was transforming from an agricultural to a value-added economy, if you like. So they're making fertilizer, they're going to attract defense industries, they're building. It's starting to become a tourist destination, and because of the conditions that South Carolina established over those generations, it virtually guaranteed that black families like the Rivers would not rise above the condition of their parents. And in fact, what we see in those generations is that the first generation, the freedom generation, the ones who were children at the time of emancipation, took advantage of those schools that South Carolina established under a multiracial democracy from 1868 until the 1870s. And they did pretty well. That's the generation of the Rivers family in the book that bought Pinefield, that bought the ancestral estates, that got more than 100 acres. In what is today prime real estate within driving distance of Charleston. It's actually a very affluent suburb right now. But then their children, as a direct consequence of the Jim Crow government and of this white supremacist system, did not have those opportunities, and they suffered, and they stagnated, and the family never recovered. And in part, that's why they lost their patrimony. That's why they lost the family estate of Pinefield. They could, this was a generation that could scarcely sign their names. And so how are they going to navigate a complex legal code that set a trap for them? Because by not probating the wills of their ancestors, by designating this family estate of Pinefield as heirs' property, it opened them up to predatory laws that forced them to sell at artificially low prices. And so I don't know if, I know in the book I have a couple of examples, but this family estate of Pinefield on Thomas Island today is a neighborhood of multi-million-dollar single-family homes with pools, with amenities. It's a short drive from the airport. That's grade A real estate. And so we can see how this process unfolded, and it has the roots that you described.
Got the pools. We just had that program. Now, he just talking about South Carolina, but we're talking about the abandoned pools of North Carolina, where same thing, white dedication to racism. We don't want no niggers in our pools, so black people don't have access. They don't have public pools in large chunks of North Carolina. I suspect you might see same patterns. They were talking about its widespread problem of black people not being able to swim and drowning, and even all that connecting all the way back to slavery, where, hey, slaves might escape if they know how to swim. So we don't teach them how to read, and we don't teach them how to swim. This I did not know. Maybe three things I can get in before we can wrap up and say we covered as much material as we can. I did not know about the railroad investment component, and that pops up a little later on in the book. I don't know, halfway, a little further along. This is the bottom of page 89, the chapter Martha and Bentley. Folks can kind of pay attention to all this, especially they fuss at black people and saying, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and why don't you invest and that sort of thing. Listen up. Nearly all the land the federal government granted to the railroads went to increase white shareholder value. Through pet finance corporations, insider trading, and bribery, the Union Pacific and other transcontinental railroads proved adept at transferring public money to their directors and shareholders. In Washington, D.C., Congress chartered a savings and trust company to benefit formerly enslaved depositors, which gambled black customers' life savings on shaky Central Pacific Railroad securities and loaned money to cronies. Doesn't that Gus T for Workplace Racism, that right there, cronyism, that is, right there, core component of white supremacy racism. Federal sponsorship went to predatory banks and railroad companies that funneled money into accounts of white owners and clients, and a sizable chunk of that capital came from African Americans. I would have never thought that in a billion years. During the Civil War, U.S. officials set up savings banks for free people in cities such as Norfolk, Virginia. Are you serious? And Beaufort, South Carolina. In 1865, Congress organized those independent banks when it incorporated them into the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, which offered a safe place to receive depositors' funds even in tiny amounts and paid interest. African Americans poured their savings into thirsty FSTC branches from Little Rock, Arkansas, and Lexington, Kentucky to New York City. The government did not guarantee or insure those deposits, but the charter required the FSTC to invest 1/3 of paid-in capital in stable government securities. Local branches ran independently, yet were required to send deposits to the head branch in Washington, D.C., which was run by a finance committee. The FSTC operated on a thin margin, but by 1867, the finance committee's head, Henry D. Cook, sought higher returns on capital than government securities yielded. Cook was an Ohio-born lawyer, journalist, railroad director, and banker. As finance committee chair, he lent deposits to real estate developers, railroads, and other enterprises. Branches like the one in Beaufort lent deposits to local businesses, getting around charter restrictions by claiming loans were merely overdrafts. What? By the early 1870s, black Americans had deposited most of their liquid assets in the FSTC. The average account held around 1/3 of a year's wages for a typical agricultural worker. Over the FSTC's 9-year life, 92% of its depositors were black, but 80% of its borrowers were white. Jesus, man. Henry Cook lent liberally to his brothers. The cronyism, can you believe it? Lent liberally to his brother's firm, J. Cook and Company, which used African American assets to finance speculation in the Northern Pacific Railroad. The gambit failed in 1873. Across the nation, many financial institutions failed, and an economic depression set in that would last 5 years. Yet, the FSTC's failure was avoidable. J. Cook transferred Northern Pacific losses out of his own bank and onto the shoulders of black depositors. Such chicanery effectively destroyed half of African Americans' liquid assets across the country. Through financial ties leading from federally sponsored railroads like the Union Pacific to a federally sponsored trust company meant to safeguard African American assets, black depositors lost to a scheme that they neither known about nor agreed to. Now that right there, what I said about ignorant, that African American assets, black depositors lost to a scheme that they'd neither known about nor agreed to. Half of them illiterate, so what? By 1874, black families across America woke up to the fact that they had been robbed by their own bank. The FSTC's failure was one of the largest depositor losses in United States banking history. I'd never even heard of this. But in many ways, Congress set up the institution to fail African Americans. Borrowers of overdue loans did not pay back 95% of them, which suggests that they never intended to repay in the first place. Stealing from African Americans had few adverse consequences to financiers like Henry and J. Cook, just like enslavers who had stolen black labor value. Those who stole the wealth of 67,000 black depositors did so with impunity. That's what I mean. Like, wow, this is such a good book. Way better than what I'd never heard of any of this, which may just mean that I am ignorant, but man, that is staggering, at least to me. Now, if you want to talk about having some sort of concerns about banking or suspicion, I'd rather keep my money in my mattress. Oh, and he even has some devastating stories about that too. But I mean, deliberate, willful looting of black people with no intention of paying. Wow. Bravo for this. Is this like a wide known component of US history, or is this a little gem that you found doing your research, Professor Schermerhorn?
Well, I have to give the credit to Professor Justine Hill Edwards, who is professor of history at the University of Virginia, who recently published a brilliant book called Savings and Trust: The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank. And she tells the story in loving detail about the incremental steps to this disaster. And so this is my gloss on it, but she can tell the backstory on the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, aka the Freedmen's Bank. But this was a huge financial loss. Now, many depositors did receive a portion of their deposits back, but the fact remains that if you don't need a conspiracy theory, just connect the dots from these government-sponsored enterprises like the Union Pacific Railroad and the failure of the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, or the Freedmen's Bank. You can't make this stuff up, right? But this is it. This is the reality that African American depositors faced, being, as the book says, robbed by their own bank. And it's the evidence to me is overwhelming that anyone who's borrowing from Henry Cook is not really planning to pay these loans back. And if they are, well, they weren't very forthcoming with the money. But as you mentioned, it wasn't just the short-term losses of the deposits, and these are hard-earned deposits, but also it's a crisis of confidence. And so when are Black Americans going to trust a white-run financial company again? Right? And so this has long-term implications. And Professor Hill Edwards actually has the receipts on this, and she's finding letters that are addressed to Franklin Roosevelt, right? decades later, asking, hey, by the way, did you ever find my ancestors missing money, because it's, still missing. So this is a generations-long story.
Wow. Now, that's the sort of thing. All that talk during COVID-19 about Nurse Rivers and the Tuskegee syphilis study, and oh man, they got lingering suspicion that for sure would be one. Now, we do remember what you did with the Freedmen's, but like, oh yeah, and that's another one to cry. Like, are you serious? All those years, like, do you think you could? We have spent that money at the strip club and the crony, I cannot say that enough. That cannot be understated. All of these generations, centuries of lying, stealing, terrorizing, plundering in all these different forms. And then on top of that, cronyism. It can't just be bootstraps and meritocracy and all that. We're going to steal from the poorest of the poor and just hook up my homies. And then turn around and say, hey, man, you need to work hard. This is about merit. Everybody here worked hard and all that. Is that your brother working there? Don't get me started on the Bush family and the Kennedy family and all that. Come on. I have no word. I'm going to have to I got the book for folks who are readers. Let's see. The full title, Savings and Trust, Justine Hill Edwards, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank, established 1865. Savings and she's got a whole black family. I bet they all got looted and lost. Every nickel in their pocket. I bet they took it all. Justine Hill Edwards, Wahoo Wah for Yahoo Scott. Wow, this does look like it's got a lot of information. Wow. Okay, great job hooking us up. Much obliged. You've been spectacular, Professor Schermerhorn. Okay, Strom Thurmond, before we can wrap up. This is the Rivers family. You write, Johnny's brother Walter Lee joined the U.S. Navy in 1946. The year South Carolina's NAACP sponsored a voter registration drive that added some 50,000 votes to the state's rolls. In 1948, President Harry S. Truman desegregated the armed forces over the protests of Jim Crow Democrats like South Carolina's Governor Strom Thurmond. Have to pause just because Pitchfork Ben Tillman is mentioned in this book. We are super familiar with him. He is one of my favorite characters, racists of all time. We did read that biography on him. He has one of my favorite quotes ever. If you scratch the white man too deep, you will find the same savage whose ancestry used to roam wild. The great South Carolina legend, former governor, founder, co-founder of Clemson University. The legend, Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Red shirts, sorry. Back to South Carolina. Truman desegregated the armed forces over the protests of Jim Crow Democrats like South Carolina's Governor Strom Thurmond. There's not enough troops in the Army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, into our churches, he maintained. Thurmond's message resonated with white Carolinians, North and South, who elected him to a U.S. Senate seat that he held until his death in 2003. Walter Lee's Navy service qualified him for education under the GI Bill, which helped create an American middle class. I thought it was so important with Strom Thurmond because people like him and Ben Tillman and working to keep black people from getting education, economic prosperity, the whole nine. With Strom Thurmond, are you familiar with the, what shall I say, reports? It's pretty widely accepted at this point that he produced a child with a black female.
I think her name was Essie Mae Washington, if I'm correct. Am I correct in that?
I think that's the offspring of that. What are we? Tragic reunion.
She was the daughter, I believe.
Right. I have pointed this out consistently for years because Strom Thurmond and the lies and hypocrisy about the lies, meritocracy and all that, and then we got all this cronyism and hooking up brothers and friends and everything else. The lies when you have white people for generations saying, stop raping the Johnsons. Remember, they go and make all these false charges to get John Johnson's property and say, oh, we got adulterous nigger and he's making children and having an affair with this white woman and all that. And then we get Strom Thurmond saying all this. He's raping a black child. This wasn't even an adult black female. This was a black child who worked in his house. The vulnerable, so you got all these ignorant black people, and all they can do, you got that in the book, that's all you can do is domestic work. That's all you can do is backbreaking, low-skilled labor so you can be easily exploited, even sexually exploited, which you do talk about in the book. But that's a pattern that I've noted where white people, they will mention Strom Thurmond, they will mention his racism, and we don't want the niggers here, we don't want the niggers in our pool. They will omit, this dude is the essence of white lying and hypocrisy, because you can't be saying all that about we can't have, and that was part of his justification, we can't have niggers in the school because they're going to rape our little white girls. You are the child rapist, Strom Thurmond, and if it was that much of a concern, why don't you keep your penis out of that black child? And it's not like Strom Thurmond was a one-off. It's generations, Thomas Jefferson and all the rest. It's generations of white people lying and being hypocrites on this, saying stay away from the Negro. We got John Johnson raping, and they're the rapists. Can you, or I guess one, is there a reason that you did not, because I always say that I think white people should always give us that sentence to include, if you're going to mention the racism of Strom Thurmond, his hypocrisy should be included, and that he had this child with a black female, because there is a conspiracy of silence, generationally it seems, to not mention that with Strom Thurmond. So was there a reason that you didn't give us that extra sentence?
There, as I recall, I didn't put it in there because I wanted to focus more on the rivers, but I didn't want to suggest anything. I thought I don't have a good answer for you there. So I was just trying to form a contrast between what the Rivers family was striving to do and what official South Carolina was preventing them from doing. So, but your point is well taken.
I'm just pointing this out with listeners because we have had a wealth of it. This is like a pattern that I've observed over years, where we had Professor J. Russell Hawkins. He wrote the book The Bible Told Them So, which is exclusively focused on South Carolina. So Strom Thurmond is a major character in that book. It's the exact same thing where he takes up a lot of time talking about the racism of Strom Thurmond and exactly what you're talking about. This was a white man who was going to be president and U.S. Senator for all those decades, very, not privileged, very powerful racist white man, talking all this, you're going to be raping our daughters and raping our little girls and you can't go to school and blah, 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 so you're going to be ignorant and illiterate and all the rest of it. You are the child rape. He didn't mention it either. That's why I'm saying it seems like this might be part of the white code too. Generationally, we protect Strom Thurmond. We don't mention that he raped a black child. He raped a black, this is a pedophile. He raped a black child. They got whole books about this. This is not contested. Even joked him about it while he was still here. He paid money and all the rest of it. Everybody should read Essie Mae Washington Williams' Dear Senator. But I mean, I say that for everyone. There should be one sentence. You don't have to write a whole page. At least one, maybe two sentences. The lie of all of this, because it's so widespread where white people say that black people are inhuman and they're all that. If that's the case, zip up your pants, get off of that black girl. Hey, get off of that black boy. There's a whole lot of that in Delectable Negro, Human Consumption, and Homoeroticism in U.S. slavery. White people raping black children. Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. That's the same thing. It's not no romance. That's child rape, unless I've been misinformed. Is that your understanding? Child rape?
That's my understanding, because not only did Sally Hemings, she was, I think, in her early teens at the time, but also she couldn't consent, right? It wasn't even an option, you know. So yeah, your point is valid, definitely, Gus.
All righty, you've been so generous. My last question, and you can depart for our Tuesday. It's a deliberate choice. You explained it at the beginning of the book, but you do not use the term slave. You have lots of different, what shall I say, synonyms. Bound laborer is one. Share with our listeners, what is your reasoning for not using the term slave when describing black people like John Johnson?
I didn't want to give the impression that slavery was totalizing, that enslavement made somebody a slave, because what we see over and over again, whether it's Martha Bentley or Henry Goings or Morris, is that these subjects acted like people first and foremost. And when I hear this in academic discourse, like slaves, I want to kind of reach through the ether there and say, please stop saying that. They're not slaves. All right. This is a legal condition. It's a legal condition that points to violence, that points to white supremacy, that points to so much. And when we start to just say, well, they're slaves, they start to think, well, okay, then there's something about them that justifies the violence, that justifies the degradation, that justifies the pain. So going back to that image of Venture Smith, who's supposed to carry this 200-pound barrel of molasses. We'll say, well, slaves bore up under. I don't want to call him a slave. I don't want to call him anything but, a fellow human being, a child of God. That these are our people, and so that's my objection. And if we can, expend a couple of more syllables to say someone is enslaved, that is, there are enslavers out there, not even putting it in the passive, to connect the subject to the object, connect the subject to the recipient of the violence. And I think that we're accomplishing something there. Because if we go back and look at the textbooks that have, educated generations of Americans, there's this kind of default, which is to say, well, we're going to categorize somebody as a slave, and therefore, in a tiny way, justify that. And then we'll maybe draw a contrast between slavery and freedom, which is such a beautiful term, right? It's so expansive and so florid. But what I want to do in the book is to say that we've got this system of plunder that transforms, right? That goes from dispossession to decapitalization through that doorway of disinheritance. And I don't want to ever compact anyone or push them into that box of saying, well, you're simply a slave. They've got to be a human first. And that's why I try in the book to use the names and try to use that context so that nobody, like Morris, who's the manager of this farm for 20 years, who's this trusted a supervisor, a superintendent who is enslaved by George Washington, or the Martha Custis's estate, if you want to be technical about it. He's never simply a slave.
Much obliged for the nuance, Professor Schermerhorn. And I've heard, I guess, a number of different scholars, historians, they have similar reasoning, logic about their usage of either enslaved or some term other than slave to identify non-white people, victims of white supremacy. And I had similar thinking prior to. There was an acute event about 5 years previously. That event has since slipped, but I had a change of opinion, and I think some of it is because there is a lot of, in the system of white supremacy, racism, white people, yourself included, are frequently not direct, are often deliberately inactive in speaking about racism, white supremacy, privilege, not power. There are lots of illustrations where we just are not direct in describing how all of this works. There'll be a lot of rhetoric, white fragility, and there'll just be a lot of white rhetoric that is, in my view, by design to evade the problem, white people being dedicated to racism. And there is this system, if you are, just everything we read in your book, white people do not think of black people as humans. That's all of the evidence. That's the whole world. That's the totality. That's the racist jokes. They do not think of Venture as a human being. You're not a man. You're not a woman. Sally Hemings. You're not a woman. None of that. You are beasts, animals here to serve us, just like the dog, which they compare them to in the book all the time. If that is true, at least in terms of this is how white people think of us and this is the system that dominates, then we should use language in trying to deconstruct this problem that does not shroud that at all. If I'm Sally Hemings and I can be raped and all of that, then let's use slave. Call me a slave until I am no longer a slave. Because some bound laborer, that's what I started with. Prince didn't have bound laborer written on his face. He had slave written on his face. If that's true, if I am a slave, call me a slave until that term is no longer applicable. And in fact, I even have to borrow Harriet Tubman. She allegedly said, I freed, I think it was thousands, hundreds, pick your number, but I freed lots of slaves, and I could have freed thousands more if they had known they were bound laborers. I humbly submit that right there might even be part of the problem. Call me a slave. If on a plantation I can even be confused where you can strip me and lash me and sell my children, if even under those circumstances, it sounds like some people thought, dang, some of these folks get confused about their status as a slave. Just call me a slave until that is no longer true. That way nobody is confused about what is happening here. That's the stance that I take now, because there's chicanery. There's lots of chicanery with the words. We don't call white people racists. We don't call black people slaves, even though they still are. Am I being logical?
It is logical, but what I'd like to go back to is the contention that this is not a system of ignorance. And so someone like Thomas Jefferson knew perhaps more than just about anybody else that Sally Hemings was fully human, right? So he could write down, oh yes, this is a slave for the purposes of accounting. But he knew differently, right? Now and so did John Martin know about, Harriet Bentley, his daughter, right? She was his slave, right, in a legal sense. He enslaved her, but she was his daughter, and he knew that, and he knew that intimately because, he had raped Harriet Bentley, her mother, and repeatedly. And so there is that distinction, right? This is not, as you say, this is not racism is not a system of ignorance. It's a system of, in many cases, feigned ignorance, but it's also an enforced belief. It's a system that requires constant, every day, every hour force, violence to police it. So yeah, but I will also concede the point that there's a lot of circumlocution going on here, where if you say someone is enslaved, you're not disclosing the agent of that action. Enslaved by whom? How does that work? And so that's if you're saying, well, if enslaved is similar in meaning to just slave, then maybe we can side with Harriet Tubman on this and just use the shorter version. But that's I think a discussion we should continue to have. I think that's a salient point. It's what I'm going to think about more. But thank you.
I was on your side for years. You people who can listen to the archives, I was saying enslaved for. I'll have to go back because there was an acute episode that stopped me, like all in one moment. It wasn't even like a build-up, or there was something acute that happened. Right, I am done. If I am a slave, call me a slave until that title no longer applies. I do not bound laborer, forced worker, anything else that come slave until that label no longer applies. That way, because we have a tendency to get confused. The book, again, that was way better than I had hoped, because I was thinking we were going to talk about California, but wow, there was so much good information. The Plunder of Black America, which I did find with that really informative report that I read a teaspoon from earlier on California. Make sure I give out the full title. It's on The Conversation, How Racism Fueled the Eaton Fire's Destruction. In Altadena, a scholar explains why discrimination can raise fire risk for Black Californians. Super important. I think lots of great information in the report. Thank you a ton for sharing a bit of your Tuesday evening. You could have been out enjoying all the good times in Arizona, chatting it up with us about your brand new publication. I guess folks should be on the lookout. You're doing book tours and all the rest. This book is brand new, so nab a copy, share. Lots to learn, in my opinion. Thank you a ton, Professor Schermerhorn.
Thank you, Gus. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
For sure. Oh, man, they put a hand up late. Do you have 30 seconds to get a quick question from a listener before we depart? If not, we'll live. But do you have 30 seconds for a quick question?
Yes.
Gentleman and a scholar. Look at that. Victim in New Jersey. Did you have a question for Professor Schermerhorn?
Thanks. Yes. Thanks a lot, Professor. Thank you, Gus. With the rising cost of rent and the rising cost of homes, how much of an effect do you think that this is going to have on the racial wealth gap? And are these rising costs going to have an effect where you're no longer going to have sundowns or say no niggas allowed? You can just basically raise the rent and also make housing unaffordable. Do you agree with that? And how and can you answer the first part of the question?
Yes. Is it Victor? Yes. Thank you for the question. So a couple of things. First of all, and this is going to be a little bit wonky, the U.S. Federal Reserve does a survey of consumer finances every 3 years. And the last survey was in 2022. The results came out in 2023, and it showed a narrowing of the black-white racial wealth gap. And the economist that did that study said, oh, you know why this narrowed? It's because of home prices that went up so much in 2021. That's more black wealth. So what you're talking about is the rise in rents. It's going to be the rise in insurance. It's the rise in borrowing costs as the rates go up. And you know there's a racial surcharge on that. So I fully expect that the next federal survey, if it's not canceled by the current administration in 2025, is going to show a widening of the wealth gap because of those surcharges. And I think you're right that these are going to fall on the shoulders of black homeowners and black families and renters especially a lot harder, because as those costs get up, they get passed along, and we're not seeing the income gains that we saw right after the pandemic. And so I think based on everything that we know, look at the results of, look at the probable outcome of the Eaton fire and Altadena, look at the rising rates of insurance in markets like Houston or in Atlanta or across the country. This is going to make it more difficult for African Americans. So I think you're onto something there.
But also the further that. But do you think that now people that really doesn't have to overtly discriminate against black people? Now you can just make rent just unaffordable. You think that's going to contribute to displacement of black people?
Yes, I do. And yes, I think so. And unfortunately I'm hesitating here because if we looked at the history of Altadena in the last 40 years, as the prices of those homes went up, the proportion of black families went down. And so that's why you had older homeowners that are able to hold on to their property, probably thanks to Proposition 13, which did a lot of other things that maybe wasn't so good for the state. But that you'll see, I think we'll see in a lot of markets that this process that you described will take place. And I want to make a plug for Senator Cory Booker, because in the conclusion of my book, I went back and my editor said, hey, tell us about some policy solutions. And just about every one of those policy solutions that was something tangible traced back to Cory Booker, who I think has done his homework and has so many great ideas about how to take the edge off some of these processes. So anyway, that's why I made the connection between Victor. I think you're calling from New Jersey.
Yes, indeed. Yes, so Professor, I'll definitely be purchasing your book. Thanks for the question. Thanks for answering the question. All right.
Victim in New Jersey is no Cory Booker. Cory Booker graduated from Stanford. That's why he's so smart. So many great ideas. Please. Much obliged, Victim in New Jersey. Now we can say thanks twice. Professor Calvin Schermerhorn hung out and even did OT to get a listener question. So you for sure did double duty. We are super grateful. He said he'll get the book to make amends. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday evening in the desert. Keep up the great scholarship. You've given us lots to research. We are grateful.
Thank you, Gus. And thank you, everyone, who was out there. Thank you for listening.
Absolutely. Have a great evening. We will keep an eye out. Be well, sir.
You as well. Be well, Gus. Bless you.
Evening. Context of White Supremacy. I can scratch one. I even have to go back and look to see, is this the first 2025 nonfiction book I've read this year? I'm going to have to go back to double check. Either way, scratched off of the list. That is one that I've been saying we should do more. This is another book. All the information about how racists have deliberately kept us from reading for centuries, and access to books, libraries, all the above. Hey, pick it, even if it's not this one, even though I submit, hey, this book is pretty constructive. Like, wow, I was very pleasantly surprised. Even if it's not this one, you say, man, Professor Calvin Schermerhorn didn't impress me. Okay, no problem. There are a lot of really constructive books that come out all the time, particularly about racism. I didn't even say you had to get a 2025 book about racism. I just say victims of white supremacy, the people that are in the less informed group about what white supremacy racism is, how it works, probably less informed about everything else. We go get one nonfiction book that was published that current calendar year and read. Study. You can even share, looking for new concepts. What's being studied, new information. Hey, you are a parent. Man, I know they got to have a book on parenting that came out. I know they got to have a book that talks about your child and smartphones. I know they got to have a book that's about your child and red dye number 40. Something that would spark your interest. Like, I might need, go get care mate and sit and talk about this one. Like, man, what we gonna do about the smartphone and Junior getting old? What we gonna do about that and all the rest of it? School, dating, something, driving, something, TV. It's got to be at least 1, 2, 5 things. I need to research. I need to learn that a real ID, something. There are books published constantly, and I cannot stress enough, if you're just talking about racism, there are books published about racism all the time. That is the subject matter on this planet. Reading, more important than watching television. Nonfiction. Any hoodles. Quick break, and we'll be right back. Pick some highlights, see if folks have any thoughts. Like I said, I learned quite a bit, but we'll be right back. Context of White Supremacy.
Black people should stay away from each other except when they have a constructive agenda. That's a part of the black code, you might say, or the compensatory code covering that. Why? Because we're full of poison, that's why. Put there by the white supremacists. We're born bathed in poison. And then they turn us loose on each other. And the first thing we start doing is messing over each other. We should stay away from each other. We're always talking about we got to get together. Not without an agenda. That's why Louis Farrakhan, when he called for the Million Man March, he laid out what? An agenda. And made it, and also knowing us, if it was told correctly, he said, when you get there, don't throw any trash down. Come in, take part in the ceremony, and as soon as it is over, get on them buses and get back where you came from. Now, I don't know whether he came up with that or somebody in his entourage or whatever. It was the correct prescription, because you cannot have black people milling around under any circumstance, not nowhere on this planet, with no agenda. Now, you know what's going to happen. All somebody's got to do is step on somebody's foot. Then it's MF this and MF that, and then 9mm popping all over the place. And everybody running and screaming. We're good at that. You can almost predict it if you get enough black people together with no agenda. I mean, you can almost feel it. I mean, if you've been around, you just kind of look around and say, uh-oh, there's about 7,000 of us here now. What are we doing here? Don't nobody know. Oh, yeah? You had better start getting away from there. Because all somebody got to do is just say what you're looking at. End of story. Complete pandemonium. Killing like you wouldn't believe on a huge scale. And because what started it? Dude was looking at me, man. He ain't got no business looking at me. I don't know him. He don't know me. I don't want to know him, ugly as he is. That's us. We call it black culture. It ain't worth 2 cents. Nowhere. Nobody with any sense would want to buy into that. E.T. or anybody from the moon would want to buy into what we call and brag about black culture. Logically speaking, why? I am here, I just got here from the planet Krypton. I would like to speak to, let's see, what do I have here? Black people. Yeah. I would like to know about what they do that they are most proud of. The first black person they talk to, average black male, and I'm not saying all of us, the first one that he walk up on, you better go back where you come from, MF. Black culture, so much for it. That's us. Hold up a mirror, really. And we've been so drunk on it so long, we brag about it. Not even out of the cradle of civilization. That's not to say that the white supremacists are civilized. They're the ones that started this mess and set it up this way. All right? They have us acting like this, and they intend for us to continue. And they will fund you. They will put up money behind you as long as you're doing something stupid. You start doing anything that looks like it's going somewhere that's going to make sense, the money is withdrawn. And we ought to know that by now. But if you're going, hey, you want to get into the drug business? No problem.
Get into the drug business, low level, mind you. And get into the drug business, we don't mean like Ozempic. Get into the drug business. We mean, you know, and even we don't mean recreational cannabis. We don't mean that like I don't know, Lucy's maybe. I'll give you a few loose cigarettes, Eric Garner style, that type of thing. Context of White Supremacy. We will be here Thursday, minimum, neutralizing workplace racism, and then again Friday, Catherine Massey Book Club, sneaky book, and it might just be I'm enjoying this book because we read books that I did not enjoy consecutively, all that Mad Dog and Dr. Maya Angelou, but sneaky, enjoyable book. I guess I don't know why I wasn't, because I'm a JFK researcher, JFK assassin researcher, so don't know why I thought I would not, but Abraham Bolden's The Echo from Dealey Plaza. Really interesting, informative read, Chicago history, and economics of white supremacy, racism in that book also. But that's same time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, both days, Thursday, Friday, and then compensatory call-in on Saturday. Hopefully constructive, worthy of your time and energy. We had a spectator, could have been a suspected racist, or no, but spectator, who commented that Gus T is insufferable. I said, whoa, wait a minute. Racism? Live and well. Gus T insufferable? Not racist man is insufferable? And Dylan Roof is insufferable? Peyton Gendron is insufferable? No. Worthless Negro from Virginia, Gus T, is insufferable. Right. Anyway, but see the thing, they'll say Gus T insufferable, and they say he is aggressive with white guests. Is that what make me insufferable? Because I'm so-called aggressive with white guests? I would rather have that on my ledger all day long that Gus T is so-called aggressive with white guests as opposed to I am aggressive with my black brothers and sisters? And or he is funny and entertaining with white people. I said that before the cows even existed. Like, I would rather die. Strip me nude and flog me in front of my cousins before you say, man, black brother Gus T is funny and entertaining when he talked to white folks. I don't know what you mean when you say aggressive, but I will take that over he is whatever else. Sweet. I don't want that one either, man. Gus sure do sound sweet when he talk to these white folks. Oh, man, I should find me another job. We should retire from the cows, maybe. The other point, one of the reasons that I'm ornery on this here microphone headset, this here spectator, oh, he is insufferable. Listen to him with the white guests, implying that they've heard me talk to white people repeatedly. If Gus T is insufferable, and I've said this for years, if you like the cows, so what? If you do not like the cows, so what? Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. If it's not constructive, you're supposed to be doing something else with your time and energy. We don't have time to waste. I put that in the prayer. Very important. Why do you continue to listen if the cows is not constructive? There's lots of that. People who at least verbalize Gus ain't constructive. Cows ain't constructive. Say all the time, deuces. All the infinite podcasts, and certainly, I mean, it's YouTube about the yin yang. They got a new season of Black Mirror, you know. Ryan Coogler got a new one. You got lots of LeBron James and playoff basketball. Man, you got so much to choose from. There's no reason for anybody listening to cows content if it ain't constructive. Now, our guest for today, it is challenging. And I would much rather talk to white people and question them, accuse them, all of that, than going back and forth with blacks. See, that's Negro culture. See, we like to joust because people don't argue and complain if you are aggressive with other black people. That's what you're supposed to do. You old watermelon head, old no-count, ignorant Negro in New Jersey. You don't know what you're talking about. You can't read. You ain't going to get no book. You don't know what you... See, that's what they, name call and fuss with some black person. That's what we're supposed to do. But a white, what? Oh, he getting on it. It is challenging because white people are easily the most informed about white supremacy racism, and it's not close. So, you're trying to talk to people classified as white to get information, learn, and you're talking to someone racist, white supremacist. Now you have to do two things. What are those two things? You have to point out where they're practicing racism, and then you try and pick out constructive information that you can use. That is a tussle. Try to do the best we can. Man, oh man, for today, I guess their book that he mentioned, Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank, Justine Hill Edwards, black female, University of Virginia scholar. I can't believe it. Wahoo wah. Anyway, probably, and it just came out last year, so not quite this year, but still, add to the library. Great to know. I mean, man, I didn't even know about that, but that is, I would love to get the inflation calculator. Like, what type of looting are we talking about? And this is like professional government looting. He said like over 60,000 black people. Like, Jesus Christ. The Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of the Freedmen's Bank. More reading. Let's see now, back to specifically that word ignorance. That's one that I will pause right there. The latter part of the discussion, we're talking about black people in the South Carolina, or even widespread. It was not just there, but South Carolina and beyond. Black people are ignorant, and all these deliberate, willful efforts on the parts of many generations of white people across the land and across the globe to keep black people ignorant and stupid. And Professor Schermerhorn was resistance. And I don't want to say that these black people are ignorant just because, the culture that they know and things that they're able to do and all of that. Man. that in a culture of white supremacy where white people bell curve us every 30 seconds, and eugenics and all the rest that you dumb, ignorant, deadhead, no-count, bird-head, woolly-minded coons, that's every 30 seconds. Why the resistance? I don't have no problem. If you're talking about Gus T, I guess I haven't facilitated the book club for 13 years. At this point, I can't say I'm illiterate. But if I was, what is the problem about me? I is ignorant. If you can't even read, you can't sign. We were just talking about that in the book club. You got a black male going up in court to testify and say, well, yeah, I signed the affidavit. Well, actually, I can't really say I signed it about Brother Bolden because I'm illiterate. So, I just put that old X right there. And they said, well, wait a minute. How you know what the forms say if you can't read? There you go. There you go. What they say, it is a pickle. I'm going to say you are ignorant. And I don't know why there would be resistance. I mean, you are so vulnerable and stupid and uninformed. I mean, you are weak. And too old that they got drones, man. You can't read the instruction to get no drone. You can't use the YouTube properly if you can't read. Can't even get on Netflix and get down if you can't read. I don't know why that is. I got to come back to that quote I just shared. It is very, very difficult to dispel ignorance if you retain arrogance. Sam Wilson, veteran. I don't see no reason that black people, really, we shouldn't hold on to being informed and bragging about how smart we are about nothing, especially not racism. 2 times, especially not racism. The boogaloo, maybe, not racism. But yeah, I don't, and I've seen that from white people often where they are resistant to just, in a serious context, aren't black people ignorant? Whoa, now I don't want to say any other time, like I said, it's bell curve any other time. And particularly talking about people that are, in fact, they are illiterate, and because of that, they don't know nothing about all these predatory laws that have been specifically crafted to steal every piece of lint, property of sand in your life. You can't read page 1. Strom Thurmond, I am so glad that right there is why we read Dear Senator Essie Mae Washington Williams, because we talked to J. Russell Hawkins about that book, The Bible Told Them So, them being white people and white Jesus, religion of white supremacy. That's why we can't have no niggers in the school. And I said the same thing to him. You got this whole book. Strom Thurmond is the main character in the book, so you got time to put in a whole paragraph, not just a sentence saying, oh yeah, by the way, this racist white dude who spent all ththese years talking about, well, hey, whoa, we can't have old raping Leroy. We can't have old Gus T in the school with us raping our little white girls. And whoa, we leave that old coon outside. That old and they ignorant anyway. You know they're ignorant anyway, because that was about South Carolina specifically. Now we can't be taxing good white people of the Palmetto State for these old burrhead coons. You know they're ignorant. Who with me? Spirit of Ben Tillman. All fine and well. If you got a whole book to say that, you can spend 3 sentences to say, oh, by the way, he did rape that black child. Ain't that hypocritical? Moving along. 3 sentences. 3 sentences. And then you can put a footnote in and read Essie Mae Washington Williams, Dear Senator. That's impossible to do. Apparently, that is impossible to do because we have piled up white authors. They will talk about Strom Thurmond and he said all these racist things and he was mean to the niggers of South Carolina, but they won't mention Didn't he rape that black child? And the pattern, all of the white people that we've talked to, they were aware that he raped a black child. They just don't include that when they talk about them. Talk about Strom Thurmond in a scholarly manner in their writing for all the public to see and for all time's sake. They just leave with minimize, obfuscate, and omit. And I'm submitting that is massive. Why are we protecting a child rapist? That's a big part of his legacy. Why? And the hypocrisy alone. Why? Why is it that something that people harp on more? Because that's so widespread in the system of white supremacy. On the micro and the macro, the hypocrisy abounds, not just on the sex issue, but on lots of issues. But on the micro, it's lots of Strom Thurmonds who went out there and talked all this. We got raping niggers and raping niggers and raping niggers, and you are the child rapist. It's lots of that. It's lots of that. Anyway, projection. One of the things I appreciated about this book that I was so surprised it had so much great information, white people getting in trouble with other white people. That's one that I highlight. I even said it in the program. He said, man, this system is not about no ignorance. No, sir. This is deliberate. What Neely Fuller Jr. said, that should be one people quote from Neely Fuller Jr. all the time. White people cannot be ignorant about racism. You will get in trouble with other white people. He got that example in the book of a white man being flogged in front of Negroes. I even had to look at that twice, like, wow, they didn't even flog him in front of other white. They flogged him in front of Negroes. You ought to know better as a white man be shacking up with some nigger woman. Ought to be ashamed of yourself. The indignity. We're going to treat you like a nigger. Now, you want to act like we're going to treat you like a nigger and beat you in front of these? Get over here, Toby. We're going to treat you like a nigger. That's how you want to act? You cannot be ignorant. They got a few of those in there, white people getting it. I always highlight that. And it happens, it even goes on through. We move into the 20th century, 1900s. And rent that property to some niggers if you want to. Act like, I didn't know. What you mean I couldn't sell the house to Lee? What you mean? Leroy was going to give me the heat, whatever. You know better as a white man. The keeping black people ignorant, all I can say is I must have greatly minimized the import of that for lots of things, for why black people behave the way that we do, not reading, our addiction to television, lots of things. Lots of things. What are the ramifications, and even appreciating the detail and conditioning that white people have invested in keeping black people ignorant. And even, you can't even just say, yeah, they have worked a lot to keep us ignorant. Myself included. Man, it's not surprising that we don't watch television. Or excuse me, that we watch television. It's not surprising that we don't read. They have worked deliberately. Strom Thurmond, some of the most powerful white people in the world. When Fuller say, I'm going to sit down and burn midnight oil, you have had some of the most powerful white people in the world for generations. What do I stay up at night doing? How can we make sure these Negroes don't read? How do we make sure these Negroes don't get no books? That's according to the record. You got lots of powerful white people. That's what they do when the sun goes down. Spend their time and energy. What are we going to do to make sure that these Negroes do not read? And what is the result of that when you have the most powerful white people in the world? They commit their time, energy, and brain power resources to that for generations, centuries at this point, because you could be killed on the plantation for learning how to read. Frederick Douglass. What's the result? Now, you want to talk about epigenetics. What's the result of that? Diseducation. It's not, it's reading is core. I mean, hey, you can't read. That's going to shut a whole lot of learning down, but school's not supposed to be there and all that. What is the result of that on a brain computer over 10 generations? We don't do no reading. We just watch the tube. Got to fight. Got to grapple and wrestle and put. I don't want to hear about what you watched on TV. I don't want to hear about what you watched on. We got to read and use our brain computer for more than watching screens. White people have trained us, really, they have groomed us for years to not use our brain computers. We're going to have to fight against that and do more reading, make time for reading, turn off that, and maybe even say, if I got time to watch TV, I got time to read. I'm not saying you got to read every moment that you spend watching TV got to be replaced with reading. That's fool talk. But I am saying, hey, all of us could commit to reading 5 minutes a day. All of us could probably even commit to reading 10 minutes a day. I know. What black person you know don't watch TV 5 minutes a day? Being that we are ignorant about racism, white supremacy, and pretty much everything else, I think we could easily commit. I'm going to read 5 minutes a day, and preferably some nonfiction, because Harry Potter is not getting it done. I'm going to say Octavia Butler is not getting it done, because you can read about the California wildfires and read Octavia Butler. That ain't getting it done. We're going to have to get to the non-fiction section for the adults and work our brain computer. I'm not disrespecting Octavia Butler. Just, wow, I have had her on my brain computer all year long. Her cemetery almost burned down in the California wildfires, and she talked and wrote about those wildfires and the doom for California. And I just talked about kindred again in the archives for the cows and everything. Is that cowbell? Yes. That is a cowbell in a couple of different ways, too. Climax of the book that I did not enjoy. Shout out. And Octavia Butler, even though she was a California native, and she is buried down in California, again, cemetery almost burned down in those wildfires. It was real close. She migrated Pacific Northwest. Beloved here in the Seattle area, have book clubs and everything else, but spent her last days loving it up. I think Lake Forest Park, which is kind of the north part of Seattle area. Lots of white people up there, dark people up there. I'm sure it's lots of folks who love them some Kindred and Parable Sower, but ain't no Leroy and Lakeisha in Lake Forest Park, Washington. Black brother in New Jersey, not a Stanford grad like Cory Booker. Victim in New Jersey, did you have commentary to share, sir?
Yes, yeah, because this was definitely this. I'm gonna read this book. I just ordered it on Amazon, $25 paperback. It reminded me of the interview kind of parallels Emily. Is it Emily Flitter?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so it kind of emulates that. I haven't got to get a book from her yet, but I am concerned with the rising prices of rent and houses. I have friends who are tirelessly looking for, and in the state of New Jersey, I mean, you're talking about two bedroom homes that's going for maybe, $400,000. So when you start talking 3 and 4, you're talking $500,000 or more. And with the the racial wealth gap, who everybody's seen to, white people pretend that it doesn't exist. I just don't see how black people in these eastern cities, cities on the west, and even metropolitan areas like Atlanta and Houston, who I think is going to follow the trends of New York metropolitan and LA metropolitan areas. So I just don't see how black Americans are going to be able to survive. It's real interesting. I've been paying attention to the Anthony, what's his name?
Carmelo Anthony.
And I thought about the money that was raised. Carmelo Anthony, yes. I was thinking about the money that was raised and the outrage of the money raised, where a lot of white killers who killed black people, they raised millions of dollars, and nobody was surprised. So the hypocrisy of white society that, couldn't even believe that, this black family wasn't able to afford the home that they lived in. That speaks to the fact that they know about the plunder of black people. So they definitely understand that, they understand that we are dealing in a deficit. Like we really don't have collectively. Just like how you didn't allow us to read or write and mocked us for being ignorant. You destroyed our wealth and you mock us for being poor. You bar us from employment and mock us for not working. So it's a cruel joke. So I can't really wait. I can't wait to get into this book and learn some more things outside of what I've heard on today's broadcast. I'm sorry I'm out of breath. Gus, I'm always in the gym when I'm listening to the broadcast. But yeah, I'll close.
Much obliged, victim in New Jersey. They got that in the text as well, like how all of this deliberate blocking niggers from employment and willful, intentional withholding information, education from black people, all of that has consequences on life expectancy. That would be an important one. That pops up over and over again, where, wow, after all that, you don't get to live to be 101 like Strom Thurmond? Really? Any hoodles, yes, lots of great detail. Emily Flitter, The White Wall, white woman. She's a journalist for the New York Times and economy or economics journalist for the New York Times, where she has lots of articles about racism in finance, where they don't let niggers cash checks, or black people who work in finance are abused and terrorized, just no loans for black people, whatever you can imagine in terms of the world of finance. Racism is right there and all over the world. Same pattern. That was a listener who informed me about that nonfiction book. In fact, they got me the book and everything. Emily Flitter's The White Wall. But that was a very constructive book, and it is similar to this, and although that is more of like a current, this is more like historical and then catching up to today, but that's more of like a very, very current last 5 years. I would say one major theme, though, is black ignorance. She starts that book off talking, I almost used the intro, she starts that book off talking about how, according to the evidence, black people are ignorant about the wealth gap between white people and black people. She said, according to studies, black people tend to think that they have about the same access to wealth and resources as white people, which is preposterous. That they drastically, we black people, drastically, like, what can I say, ignorantly underestimate the gap between the wealth that white people have and what we think niggers have, which I can only, it is very, very difficult to dispel ignorance if you retain arrogance. Let's see.
Gus, if I can add, I'm sorry.
Let me. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say, when you talk about the ignorance and adding to that, that's why the ignorance and we get caught up in repeating things that we heard without investigation, or repeating tropes about the laughable spending power of black people that, at times they say 1.7 trillion or 2 trillion, but nobody ever talks about the spending power of white people, and I wonder why.
Amen. Like, yeah, that's at the beginning of the White Wall. Like, you don't even have to read the whole book. That part might even be in the introduction to the book. And like I said, it's evidence-based in terms of all this, but yeah, we are not intelligent about white supremacy, racism, or much of anything else. Pitiful. Worthy of tremendous pity. Any hoodles. Thursday, neutralizing workplace racism. Friday, Abraham Bolden's The Echo from Dealey Plaza, and then compensatory call-in this weekend. I even that the Atlanta and Houston and the astronomical increase in insurance rates, housing rates, direct impact. I mean, wow, those are locations that have such high numbers of black people. It would not surprise me at all to make housing inaccessible in those areas, and particularly even Houston. The hurricane was just there not that long ago. They had the power outage, and and that's kind of close to where they were having the measles outbreak as well. In fact, that's what they were saying, like, you get people caught that are already vulnerable and then get them caught in a situation where there's some sort of health problem, or you have people that are not vaccinated, they might be more vulnerable. I'm not a doctor, but a doctor did write a book about that exact sort of vulnerability for places like Houston. Shout to Dr. Gerald Horn. Anyway, we will be back at a minimum on Thursday. Lots of books mentioned in this program. If you've not read Essie Mae Washington Williams' Dear Senator, nab that one. It's at the libraries. I thought it was very constructive. In the book club, Catherine Massey. That's it. Much obliged, folks, listening in. Hopefully worthy of your time and energy. Sobriety would be best under conditions of white supremacy. We need high-functioning brain computers to solve our problems. Creator, help us maximize our time and energy to replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Remind us not to waste non-white people's time and energy, especially our own. Stop name-calling black people. Stop gossiping. Stop producing throwaway offspring. The environmental racism, we have talked about that a lot. In fact, California Wildfires, right there, talking all that. Can you breathe? Are they going to test the soil? Is it going to be safe is it even going to be safe to garden? All this fire debris gets into the soil. Put that on your Earth Day, April 2-2. Cal signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. No problem. You're a victim. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my condition. Mm-hmm. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.